The sharp sound of brakes pierced through the quiet morning as Caleb Watson swerved his silver Tesla to a stop just short of the intersection. Glancing up at the traffic light, his mind wandered back to the stack of paperwork waiting on his desk. Owning a chain of upscale hotels had its perks, but Caleb, now 35 and one of the youngest billionaires in the country, rarely felt free to enjoy them. Follow the whole story and don't forget to subscribe to the channel and leave your opinion below in the comments section. It motivates us to share more impactful stories. His schedule left little room for spontaneity, yet something about today tugged at his usual routine. Instead of heading straight to his office in downtown Atlanta, he had taken the long route through a neighborhood he hadn't visited in years, a part of the city he once called home. As the light turned green, Caleb caught a glimpse of a man standing on the sidewalk. Dressed in layers of tattered clothing, the man's face was shadowed by a baseball cap pulled low over his brow. But it wasn't the man's disheveled appearance that made Caleb's breath hitch. It was the striking resemblance staring back at him. Could it be? Caleb muttered, shaking his head. The idea seemed absurd. Yet he couldn't shake the nagging feeling that he knew this man, though from where he couldn't tell. The Tesla hummed to life as Caleb drove past the intersection, but his thoughts lingered on the stranger. Something about the encounter stirred an unease within him, like a fragment of his past had resurfaced, demanding attention. By the time he reached his office, Caleb's mind was still stuck on the man. Piles of emails and meeting requests couldn't distract him. Finally, during his lunch break, he made a decision. He would go back to the neighborhood and speak to the man. Caleb's mind reeled as he took a shaky step toward the man. Up close, the resemblance was even more unsettling. The same sharp cheekbones, the same piercing eyes. It was as if he were staring at a reflection warped by time and hardship. The man looked at him with a half-smile, though his eyes held a weary sadness. "I never expected to see you here," he said, his voice rough but steady. Caleb blinked, struggling to find his own voice. "I'm sorry. Do we know each other?" The man chuckled dryly. "Depends on what you mean by no. You could say we're family in a way." He looked down, shuffling his feet, as if bracing himself for something. Family? Caleb's mind raced. His family tree was short, with most relatives distanced by miles or silence, and he was certain he'd remember a man like this, if he'd ever met him. The stranger shifted, seeming to sense Caleb's confusion. "I know it sounds strange, but," he trailed off, rubbing the back of his neck as if searching for the right words. "Let's just say we share a story that started long before you knew it existed." Caleb's heart thudded in his chest. He knew he should probably leave, or at least call someone, but curiosity held him there. "What's your name?" The man hesitated. "Ethan." He glanced up, his gaze sharp. "Ethan Ward." The name struck Caleb with an odd familiarity, like a half-remembered melody. "Ethan Ward. And you think we're connected somehow?" Ethan nodded. "More than you'd believe." He looked down, folding his hands as though steeling himself. "Look, I don't expect you to believe me, but you were born into a world that I was pushed out of." Caleb took a breath, trying to make sense of it all. "Are you saying you're homeless because of me?" Ethan shook his head, his expression softening. No. My choices, my mistakes, they're all my own. But there's a story here, one I think you deserve to know." He paused, studying Caleb. "If you're willing to listen." Caleb's phone buzzed in his pocket, a reminder of the meeting he was already late for. But as he looked into Ethan's eyes, he realized that whatever was happening here held more weight than a missed appointment. "I'll listen," Caleb said, his voice barely above a whisper. Ethan's face softened, and he motioned to a small coffee shop across the street. "Let's sit. It's a long story, and it's not one I can tell standing here." Caleb nodded, curiosity overriding caution as he followed Ethan into the shop. They settled into a booth by the window, and Caleb found himself acutely aware of how out of place they must have looked together. A polished executive beside a man who seemed like he'd been through every hardship life could throw. Ethan leaned forward, his hands folded tightly as if bracing himself. "Before I begin," he said, "you should know this isn't an easy story to hear. But it's a story that needs to be told." Caleb held his gaze, determined to uncover the truth. Then let's hear it. Ethan's voice dropped, the weight of his words filling the small booth. I wasn't always like this, he began. Once, I had a life most people would envy. A good job, a promising future. But life has a way of testing you, and sometimes the choices you make can turn everything upside down. Caleb leaned forward, his interest piqued. The man sitting across from him looked weathered, but his tone carried the authority of someone who had lived through extraordinary things. What happened? Caleb asked, his voice steady but curious. Ethan sighed, tracing an invisible pattern on the table with his finger. I grew up in a family that believed in hard work above all else. My father built his company from scratch, and by the time I was in my 20s, he wanted me to take over. It was the kind of opportunity most people dream about. His voice grew quiet. But I wasn't ready. Caleb frowned. What do you mean? Ethan hesitated, his gaze flickering to the street outside. I thought I was. At least, I convinced myself I was. But when the time came, I made mistakes. I didn't listen to advice, thought I could do it all on my own. And when things started falling apart, instead of owning up to it, I ran. The words hung in the air between them, heavy with regret. Caleb shifted in his seat, unsure how to respond. You left? Ethan nodded slowly. I walked away from everything. My family, the business, all of it. I thought I'd start fresh, prove to myself I could build something on my own. But life doesn't work that way. Without support, without guidance. I failed. And when I tried to go back, he trailed off, his voice breaking slightly. It was too late. Caleb felt a strange pang in his chest. He didn't know why, but Ethan's story struck a chord. So, you ended up here, he said softly. Ethan nodded again. Not right away. I worked odd jobs, moved around a lot. But the past has a way of catching up with you. Every bridge I burned, every mistake I made, it all added up. And now, he gestured at his worn clothes and tired face. Here I am. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The sounds of the coffee shop buzzed around them. Cups clinking, muted conversations, but it all felt distant. Caleb studied Ethan, searching for some kind of connection. Why are you telling me this? He finally asked. Ethan's gaze locked onto Caleb's, piercing and unflinching. Because I see myself in you, he said. I see the ambition, the drive, and the blind spots. You're walking a path I know all too well, Caleb. And I don't want you to make the same mistakes. Caleb leaned back, stunned. You don't even know me. Ethan smiled faintly. Maybe not, but I've seen enough. The way you carry yourself, the way you stop to talk to me instead of brushing me off like everyone else. It says a lot. Caleb shook his head, trying to process everything. This doesn't make sense. Why now? Why me? Ethan's expression grew serious. Because I know where that path leads. And because, he hesitated, as if weighing whether to reveal more. Because there's something else you need to know. Something I've been carrying for a long time. Caleb's stomach tightened. What is it? Ethan leaned in, his voice dropping to barely a whisper. You and I, we're connected in ways you can't imagine. And if you're willing to hear me out, I'll tell you everything. Caleb shifted in his seat, his curiosity mounting with every second. Ethan's words had stirred something within him, a strange combination of dread and intrigue that he couldn't shake. This man, a stranger on the surface, spoke as if he knew Caleb's path better than he did. Ethan glanced around the cafe, checking to see if anyone was within earshot. Satisfied they were alone, he leaned closer. This might sound unbelievable, but you're tied to a part of my past that I've tried to forget. I've kept it hidden for years, but it's time you knew. Caleb's heart thumped in his chest, his thoughts racing. What are you talking about? Ethan's eyes bore into him. Your father. He and I, we were close once. Very close. The words took a moment to sink in, but when they did, Caleb's mind reeled. His father? He remembered his father as a strict, reserved man, someone who rarely spoke of his own past. The idea that this man, homeless, disheveled, clearly struggling, could have once known him seemed absurd. My father? How? He never mentioned you. Ethan gave a bitter smile. He wouldn't. We had a falling out, let's call it. He had dreams, ambitions, big ones, and he was willing to do whatever it took to achieve them. I, on the other hand, didn't quite have the same vision. We took different paths, and in the end, he made sure I was out of the picture. Caleb frowned, trying to picture his father, the disciplined and driven man he knew, crossing paths with someone like Ethan. My father is a successful man. He's not the type to abandon people. Ethan's face tightened. Believe what you want, but I know what I lived through. There was a time when I thought we'd be partners, building something that could change lives. But he saw things differently. To him, I was expendable, just another obstacle in his way. Caleb shook his head, struggling to reconcile this version of his father with the man he'd grown up with. Why would he cut you out like that? Ethan's expression grew somber. Because I refused to play by his rules. He wanted power, influence, at any cost. When I challenged him, he didn't take it well. The next thing I knew, I was out, with nothing left but the clothes on my back. Silence settled between them, heavy and tense. Caleb felt a cold knot form in his stomach. He'd always admired his father's success, his relentless drive. But he'd never considered the sacrifices or betrayals it might have taken to get there. Why are you telling me this now? Caleb asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Ethan looked away, a hint of regret in his eyes. Because I see the same fire in you, Caleb. You have that same hunger, that ambition. But I'm afraid it's leading you down the same path. One that destroys everything in its way. Caleb opened his mouth to protest, to deny the comparison. But the words wouldn't come. Instead, he thought of the late nights, the endless meetings, the strained friendships, and the constant pressure to succeed. Was he becoming the man his father once was? Ethan continued, his voice softer now. I don't know if you're willing to hear this, but sometimes success isn't worth the price. There are things more valuable than power, things your father and I both lost along the way. A flicker of doubt crept into Caleb's mind, and for the first time, he felt uncertain. He'd always believed that success was all that mattered, that his father's legacy was something to uphold. But now he wasn't so sure. Ethan reached into his pocket and pulled out a worn, faded photograph, sliding it across the table. Caleb looked down, his breath catching as he recognized the faces staring back at him. His father, young, vibrant, standing beside a smiling, younger Ethan. The two looked inseparable, their smiles wide and genuine. Believe it or not, Ethan said quietly, we were once like brothers. Caleb felt a pang in his chest, a strange mixture of envy and sorrow. He'd never seen his father look so happy. Ethan's voice broke the silence. Your father chose his path, and I chose mine. And while I can't go back and change the past, maybe I can stop you from making the same mistakes. Caleb's gaze lingered on the photograph, questions swirling in his mind. He looked up at Ethan, his voice barely a whisper. What do you want from me? Ethan gave a weary smile. I don't want anything, Caleb. I just want you to know the truth. And maybe, just maybe, you'll choose a different path. The cafe door swung shut behind Ethan, leaving Caleb alone with the photograph. He stared at the image, his father's youthful face frozen in a smile he could hardly recognize. The man in the picture wasn't the father he knew, the polished, poised figure who preached success at any cost. No, this version of his father looked free. Caleb shook himself, tucking the photo into his wallet. Ethan's words echoed in his mind, a warning he couldn't ignore but didn't quite want to believe, either. His father was a powerful man who had built something remarkable, but now there was a shadow over it, an implication that it was all built on betrayal. Caleb couldn't shake the feeling, and as he left the cafe, he felt a strange urgency to uncover the truth. But he also felt an unfamiliar sense of dread. What if Ethan was right? What if his father's empire was a facade built on lies? He climbed into his car, gripping the steering wheel tightly, and drove without thinking. The city streets blurred past as he tried to process what he'd learned. It wasn't until he found himself parked outside his father's office building that he realized where he'd gone. The towering building stood like a silent fortress, looming over the city. It was a place Caleb knew well, a place that had come to symbolize his father's power and influence. For years, Caleb had aspired to follow in his father's footsteps, to carve his own place in that very same building. But now, he wasn't sure if he wanted that anymore. He stepped out of his car, still unsure of what he was looking for, and walked into the lobby. The security guard nodded at him, recognizing him immediately. "Good evening, Mr. Callahan. Here to see your father?" Caleb hesitated. "Yes. Is he in?" The guard glanced at his screen, then nodded. "He's in a meeting, but I can let him know you're here." Caleb waved him off. "No need. I'll wait in his office." He took the elevator up, feeling a knot tighten in his stomach as he neared his father's office. He'd always felt a certain reverence for this place, the culmination of his father's life's work. But now, it felt different, like he was seeing it for the first time. When he reached his father's office, he found the door slightly ajar. Frowning, he stepped inside, taking in the familiar sight of polished wood, leather-bound books, and sleek, modern furniture. It was a room designed to intimidate, to project power and control. Caleb approached his father's desk, his eyes scanning the various papers and files scattered across it. One document caught his attention, a contract bearing the name of a company he didn't recognize. He picked it up, skimming the contents. It was a merger agreement, filled with complex legal language. But what struck him was the clause at the bottom, outlining the buyout of a former partner. The partner's name was Ethan. Caleb's heart pounded as he read the terms of the buyout. Ethan had been forced out of the company years ago, with little compensation and a strict non-compete clause that had left him unable to work in his field. His father had effectively erased him, leaving him with nothing. A wave of anger surged through Caleb. His father had built an empire, but at what cost? Ethan's story wasn't just a bitter memory. It was proof that his father had been ruthless in his pursuit of power, willing to destroy anyone who got in his way. The sound of footsteps snapped Caleb out of his thoughts. He looked up to see his father standing in the doorway, his expression unreadable. "Caleb," he said, his tone calm but cautious. "What are you doing here?" Caleb hesitated, the contract still clutched in his hand. I wanted to talk to you." His father's eyes flicked to the contract, and a shadow crossed his face. "About?" Caleb took a deep breath, trying to keep his voice steady. "I met someone today, a man named Ethan. He told me a lot about you, and about your past." His father's expression hardened, a flicker of irritation crossing his face. "Ethan? He's nobody, Caleb. A man who couldn't keep up. Whatever he told you, it's in the past. It has nothing to do with you." "But it does," Caleb insisted, his voice rising. "You used him. You took everything from him just to get ahead. And now he has nothing." His father's gaze turned steely. "I did what I had to do. Business isn't about sentimentality, Caleb. It's about survival. Ethan was weak, and he didn't belong in this world. I built this company from the ground up, and I wasn't going to let anyone stand in my way." Caleb shook his head, feeling a mix of anger and disbelief. "So you just discarded him? Like he was nothing?" His father's eyes narrowed. "You're too idealistic, Caleb. In this world, it's kill or be killed. Ethan didn't have the stomach for it, and he paid the price. That's the reality of success." A silence fell between them, heavy and charged. Caleb stared at his father, seeing him in a new light. This was the man he'd admired, the man he'd looked up to his entire life. But now, he wasn't sure if he recognized him. "I don't think I want to be like you," Caleb said quietly. His father's expression darkened. "You're my son, Caleb. You're already like me. And one day, you'll understand that everything I did for you. To give you a life of power, respect, and control." Caleb felt a chill run down his spine. He turned and walked toward the door, his mind racing with thoughts he couldn't quite articulate. As he reached the hallway, he looked back at his father one last time. "I think you did it all for yourself," he said, his voice barely audible. His father didn't respond, watching him with a cold, calculating gaze. The night air was sharp and cold as Caleb exited the office building, his mind in turmoil. He had spent his entire life trying to earn his father's approval, but tonight felt like a breaking point. Ethan's warning had been clear, and the contract he had just read confirmed it. His father wasn't just ruthless, he was cruel. As he walked toward his car, Caleb felt the weight of a decision looming over him. Confronting his father was one thing. Doing something about it was another. The picture Ethan had shown him still lingered in his thoughts. That carefree version of his father hinted at a man Caleb had never known. Sliding into the driver's seat, Caleb pulled out his phone and stared at Ethan's number. His finger hovered over the call button before he finally pressed it. The phone rang twice before Ethan picked up. His voice was hesitant, as if he wasn't expecting Caleb to call. "Hello? It's Caleb," he said, gripping the steering wheel tightly. "I've been thinking about what you said earlier. About my father. About everything. I need to know more." There was a pause on the other end. "Are you sure? The truth isn't going to be easy for you to hear." "I'm sure," Caleb said firmly. "Meet me." Ethan sighed. "All right. There's a diner on 5th and Monroe. Meet me there in an hour." Caleb agreed and hung up, his resolve hardening. He wasn't sure what he would find, but he knew he couldn't stop now. The diner was nearly empty when Caleb arrived. The smell of coffee and fried food greeted him as he stepped inside. Ethan was already seated in a booth near the back, nursing a cup of coffee. He looked up as Caleb approached, his face wary but calm. "You came," Ethan said, gesturing for Caleb to sit. Caleb slid into the booth, his eyes locking onto Ethan's. "Start from the beginning." Ethan took a sip of his coffee, setting the cup down with a slight tremor in his hands. "Your father and I started the company together. We were young, ambitious, and willing to take risks. For a while, it was great. We were a team. But as the company grew, so did your father's hunger for control." Caleb listened intently as Ethan recounted the rise of their business and the cracks that began to form in their partnership. He described how his father had manipulated contracts, forged alliances behind Ethan's back, and eventually forced him out entirely. "He made it impossible for me to recover," Ethan said, his voice heavy with bitterness. "He didn't just take the company. He took my reputation, my livelihood. I lost everything because of him." Caleb felt a pang of guilt, though he wasn't sure why. "Why didn't you fight back?" "I tried," Ethan said, his gaze hardening. "But your father is resourceful. He had the money, the connections, and the will to destroy me. By the time I realized what was happening, it was too late." Caleb leaned back, processing Ethan's words. "If all of this is true, why now? Why come to me?" Ethan hesitated, his expression softening. "Because I see a chance for something different. You're not like him, Caleb. You still have a choice. You can decide what kind of man you want to be." Caleb felt the weight of Ethan's words settle over him. He had always admired his father's success, but now he saw the cost of that success. And for the first time, he questioned whether it was worth it. Ethan leaned forward, his voice lowering. "There's more to the story, Caleb. Things your father has kept hidden. Not just from me, but from everyone. If you really want to know the truth, you're going to have to dig deeper." "What do you mean?" Caleb asked, his curiosity piqued. Ethan pulled out a small, weathered notebook and slid it across the table. "This is all I have left, a record of everything I could piece together over the years. Names, dates, deals your father made in the shadows. It's not complete, but it's a start." Caleb stared at the notebook, his heart pounding. Taking it felt like crossing a line, but he couldn't walk away now. He picked it up, flipping through the pages. The details were damning. Proof of backroom deals, betrayals, and unethical practices. "This is a lot," Caleb said, closing the notebook. "What do you expect me to do with it?" "Whatever you think is right," Ethan said. "But be careful. Your father won't take kindly to anyone digging into his past, even you." Caleb nodded, tucking the notebook into his jacket. "Thanks for trusting me with this." Ethan gave a faint smile. "Don't thank me yet. You're stepping into a world your father controls. Just make sure you're ready for what comes next." As Caleb drove home, the notebook felt like a ticking time bomb in his jacket pocket. He knew he was stepping onto dangerous ground, but he also felt a strange sense of clarity. For years, he had followed the path his father had laid out for him, never questioning where it would lead. But now, for the first time, he felt like he was making his own choices. The phone vibrated insistently in the passenger seat, the caller ID flashing "Dad." Caleb's grip tightened on the steering wheel, his mind racing. He hadn't spoken to his father since the tense meeting that afternoon. What could he possibly want now? The call stopped, then immediately started again. Caleb exhaled sharply and hit the speaker button. Hello? Caleb. His father's deep voice rumbled through the car. Where are you? I'm on my way home, Caleb replied cautiously. Good, his father said, his tone brisk and commanding. Come straight to the house. We need to discuss something important. Caleb hesitated, his heart thudding against his rib cage. What's this about? I'll explain when you get here, his father said, his voice leaving no room for argument. Don't keep me waiting. The line went dead, leaving Caleb with an uneasy feeling in the pit of his stomach. Whatever his father wanted, it couldn't be good. When Caleb pulled into the driveway of his father's sprawling estate, the house loomed over him like a fortress. The warm glow of the lights spilling out from the windows did little to quell the sense of foreboding growing in his chest. The butler, Mr. Aldridge, opened the door before Caleb could knock. Your father is waiting for you in the study, he said, his expression as unreadable as ever. Caleb nodded and stepped inside, the familiar scent of polished wood and expensive cologne greeting him. He made his way to the study, his footsteps echoing in the cavernous halls. His father was seated behind the massive oak desk, a glass of bourbon in one hand. He looked up as Caleb entered, his piercing gaze locking onto his son. Sit down, his father said, gesturing to the chair across from him. Caleb sat, his posture stiff. What's this about? His father leaned back in his chair, swirling the bourbon in his glass. I've been hearing things, Caleb. Rumors. People talking about you asking questions. Questions that don't concern you. Caleb's stomach dropped. Was it possible that his father already knew about his meeting with Ethan? He forced himself to remain calm. I don't know what you're talking about. Don't play dumb with me, his father snapped, his voice sharp. You've been sniffing around where you shouldn't. I taught you better than that. Caleb's jaw tightened. Maybe I'm just trying to understand the truth. His father's expression darkened, and for a moment, Caleb thought he might explode. Instead, he laughed, a cold, mirthless sound that sent a chill down Caleb's spine. The truth, his father said, shaking his head. You have no idea what you're getting yourself into. Then explain it to me, Caleb said, his voice rising. Tell me why Ethan would say the things he did. Tell me why there's a notebook full of evidence that paints you as a liar and a thief. The words hung in the air like a bomb waiting to explode. His father's eyes narrowed, his hand tightening around the glass. So, he finally got to you, his father said, his tone venomous. I warned him to stay away, but I suppose some people never learn. Maybe he wouldn't have to get to me if you weren't hiding something, Caleb shot back. You've spent your entire life building this empire, but at what cost? How many people have you destroyed along the way? His father stood abruptly, the glass slamming onto the desk. Enough, he bellowed. You don't understand what it takes to succeed in this world. You don't understand the sacrifices I've made for you, for this family. Caleb rose to his feet, his anger boiling over. Don't pretend this is about me. This has always been about you. Your ego, your ambition. You've hurt people, and now it's catching up to you. His father's face twisted in fury, but he said nothing. For a moment, the two men stared each other down, the tension crackling between them. Finally, his father broke the silence. You want the truth? Fine. But once you hear it, there's no going back. Are you ready for that? Caleb didn't flinch. I'm ready. His father's lips curled into a bitter smile. We'll see about that. The conversation ended as abruptly as it began, with his father dismissing him like an unruly employee. As Caleb left the study, his mind churned with questions. What was his father hiding? And how far would he go to keep those secrets buried? When he got back to his apartment, Caleb pulled out Ethan's notebook and began flipping through the pages again. This time, he noticed something he hadn't before. A name that appeared repeatedly. Simon Grayson. Simon Grayson was a name Caleb recognized. He was an old associate of his father's, a man who had vanished from the business world years ago. If anyone could shed more light on his father's dealings, it would be him. Caleb picked up his phone and began searching for Simon Grayson, hoping to find a way to contact him. As he typed, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. The next morning, Caleb was up before the sun. His mind was still racing from the confrontation with his father and the strange sensation of being watched. His search for Simon Grayson had turned up little, just old articles from a decade ago about his rise as a real estate mogul and his sudden disappearance from the public eye. Still, one article mentioned a rural estate Simon had purchased in upstate New York shortly before his vanishing act. It wasn't much, but it was a lead. Caleb packed a bag, tossed it into his car, and hit the road. The drive was long and winding, the kind that gave a person too much time to think. Caleb couldn't stop replaying his father's words. You want the truth? Fine. What truth? And why did his father seem so certain that Caleb wasn't ready for it? By the time he reached the small town near Simon's estate, the sky was overcast, the air heavy with the promise of rain. Caleb parked at a gas station and pulled up the estate's location on his phone. It was still another 15 minutes away, hidden deep within a forested area. The station attendant, an older man with a grizzled beard, leaned against the counter as Caleb paid for gas. You're not from around here, are you? The man asked. No, Caleb said, shaking his head. Just passing through. The man raised an eyebrow. Passing through to where? Caleb hesitated. I'm looking for someone. Simon Grayson. Heard he might live around here. The man's demeanor shifted, his expression guarded. Grayson, huh? Haven't heard that name in years. Folks around here don't talk much about him. Why not? The man shrugged, but there was a glint of unease in his eyes. Just one of those things. People say he went off the deep end after his business went under. Lives like a recluse now. If I were you, I'd leave him be. Caleb thanked the man and left, but his curiosity had only grown. What could have driven someone as successful as Simon Grayson to vanish so completely? The road to Simon's estate was overgrown and narrow, barely wide enough for Caleb's car. Branches scraped against the windows as he drove, the dense trees blocking out what little sunlight remained. When he finally reached the estate, he was struck by how desolate it looked. The once grand house was now a shadow of its former self, its paint peeling and its windows cracked. Weeds had overtaken the driveway, and the front gate hung crookedly on its hinges. Caleb parked and stepped out of the car, his boots crunching on the gravel. He approached the house cautiously, his eyes scanning for any signs of life. Before he could knock, the door creaked open, and a man stepped out. He was older than Caleb had expected, his hair a mix of silver and white, but his posture was straight and his eyes sharp. Who are you, and what do you want? The man demanded, his voice rough from disuse. Mr. Grayson? Caleb asked. The man's eyes narrowed. Depends on who's asking. My name is Caleb Lawson, he said, his voice steady. I need your help. Simon's gaze flickered with recognition at the mention of Caleb's last name. Lawson, he repeated, his tone cold. As in Garrett Lawson? He's my father, Caleb admitted. Simon's expression darkened, and for a moment, Caleb thought the man might slam the door in his face. Instead, Simon sighed heavily and stepped aside. You'd better come in. The inside of the house was as worn as the outside, but it was clear that Simon had tried to maintain some semblance of order. Papers and books were stacked on every available surface, and the air smelled faintly of dust and coffee. Simon gestured for Caleb to sit in a threadbare armchair. You've got 5 minutes to tell me why I shouldn't throw you out. Caleb didn't waste time. I found something that suggests my father might not be the man I thought he was, he said. I'm trying to understand the truth, but I need your help to do it. Simon snorted. The truth? That's a dangerous thing to look for when it comes to Garrett Lawson. I know, Caleb said, leaning forward, but I have to know. What happened between you two? Simon's jaw tightened, and for a moment, he said nothing. Then he stood and walked to a nearby cabinet, pulling out a thick file folder. He dropped it onto the coffee table in front of Caleb. This is what happened, Simon said bitterly. Caleb opened the folder, his eyes scanning the documents inside. They were contracts, letters, and financial statements, all of them damning. Each one painted a picture of betrayal, of deals manipulated and partners ruined. I trusted your father, Simon said, his voice heavy with regret. We built something together, something I thought was unbreakable. But Garrett used me. He stole from me, sabotaged me, and when I tried to fight back, he destroyed me. Caleb felt a pang of guilt, though he wasn't sure why. Why didn't you go public with this? Simon shook his head. Garrett has connections, powerful ones. If I'd gone public, he would have buried me deeper than he already has. So, I disappeared. It was the only way to survive. As Simon spoke, Caleb's phone buzzed in his pocket. He ignored it at first, but when it buzzed again, he pulled it out. The screen showed an unknown number, and a sense of unease washed over him. He answered cautiously. Hello? Mr. Lawson, a distorted voice said on the other end. You're treading on dangerous ground. Stop now, or you'll regret it. The line went dead before Caleb could respond. Caleb's hand trembled as he placed his phone on the table. The distorted voice echoed in his mind, each word sharp and chilling. Someone was watching him, tracking his every move. But how? And why had they waited until now to make their presence known? Simon noticed Caleb's pale expression and leaned forward. What's wrong? Caleb hesitated, unsure if he should involve Simon any further. But as he looked at the older man, who had already lost so much, he decided to be honest. I just got a call. Someone warned me to stop digging. They knew I was here. Simon's face darkened, his expression unreadable. That doesn't surprise me, he said grimly. Garrett's people are everywhere. He's always had a way of keeping tabs on anyone who gets too close to the truth. But how would they know where I am? Caleb asked, frustration lacing his words. I haven't told anyone about this. Simon gestured toward Caleb's phone. Technology makes it easy. A simple tracker, spyware, there are a dozen ways they could be monitoring you. If you're serious about this, you need to start being careful. Very careful. Simon stood and walked to the window, peering out as if expecting someone to appear from the trees. If they've already warned you, it means they're nervous. That's a good thing. Caleb frowned. How is that a good thing? It means you're close to something they don't want you to find, Simon said, turning back to face him. But it also means they'll escalate if you keep pushing. For a moment, Caleb considered backing off. Was uncovering the truth about his father worth risking his safety, or worse? But then he thought about the people his father had hurt, about Simon's ruined life, and the growing sense that Garrett Lawson wasn't just a ruthless businessman but something far darker. I can't stop, Caleb said firmly. Not now. Simon studied him for a moment before nodding. Then you'll need more than determination. You'll need allies. Caleb tilted his head. What kind of allies? Simon walked to a cabinet, opening it to reveal a dusty briefcase. He placed it on the table and opened it, revealing stacks of old documents and photographs. These are the people who suffered because of your father, he said. Some of them might still be willing to talk, if you can find them. Caleb sifted through the papers. Most were legal documents, but a few were personal letters, pleas for help from people who had been financially ruined or manipulated by Garrett. One name stood out, Elena Pierce. Who's Elena Pierce? Caleb asked, holding up a photograph of a striking woman in her late 30s. She was Garrett's right-hand woman for years, Simon explained. She knew all his secrets, but when she tried to leave, things went south. She disappeared not long after. Disappeared? Caleb repeated, his stomach sinking. Simon nodded grimly. Some say she's dead. Others think she went into hiding, like I did. If anyone knows the full extent of Garrett's operations, it's her. Caleb stared at the photograph, his mind racing. If Elena was alive, she could be the key to everything. But finding her would be like searching for a needle in a haystack. Do you know where she might be? Caleb asked. Simon hesitated. I heard rumors a few years ago that she was living in Detroit under a new identity. But that's all they were, rumors. Before Caleb could respond, a loud noise outside made them both jump. It sounded like tires crunching on gravel. Simon moved to the window, pulling back the curtain just enough to peer out. Someone's here, he said, his voice low. Caleb's heart pounded as he joined Simon at the window. A black SUV was parked at the edge of the driveway, its engine idling. Two men in suits stepped out, their movements deliberate and calculated. Simon cursed under his breath. They found us. How? Caleb whispered, his mind racing. They've been watching me for years, Simon said. Guess they finally decided to act. What do we do? Simon grabbed Caleb by the arm and pulled him toward the back of the house. We get out of here. Now. The two men slipped out through a side door, staying low as they made their way toward the forest. The rain that had threatened all day finally began to fall, the drops masking their footsteps as they moved deeper into the woods. Caleb glanced back and saw the men searching the house. They moved with military precision, their faces cold and focused. Who are they? Caleb whispered. Garrett's enforcers, Simon replied. They're not here to talk. The weight of Simon's words sank in, and Caleb realized just how far his father was willing to go to protect his secrets. As they reached a clearing, Simon stopped and turned to Caleb. There's a safe house about a mile from here, he said. We can regroup there. But you need to understand something, Caleb. This isn't a game. If you keep going, there's no turning back. I know, Caleb said, his voice steady. Simon studied him for a moment before nodding. Then let's move. The sound of footsteps behind them spurred them forward, their breaths coming in sharp bursts as they ran through the rain-soaked forest. Caleb's mind raced with questions, but one thing was clear. The danger was only beginning. The sound of the gunshot echoed through the trees, its sharp crack making Caleb's heart race even faster. He instinctively grabbed Simon's arm, pulling him to a halt. Did you hear that? Caleb gasped, his voice barely above a whisper. Simon nodded, his eyes scanning the forest around them. I heard it, and it wasn't a warning shot. Then what was it? Simon turned toward Caleb, his face hardening. A warning to us. Before Caleb could respond, they both heard the sound of footsteps, fast and deliberate, cutting through the rain-drenched forest. Someone was following them. Caleb's pulse quickened, and he felt the weight of the situation hit him. His father's men were closing in. They didn't have much time. Simon grabbed Caleb by the shoulder, his grip tight and urgent. We need to move. Now. Caleb didn't hesitate, nodding quickly. They began running again, the rain now pouring down in sheets. The forest floor was slick with mud, and each step felt like it could be their last. The sound of the rain was deafening, but in the distance, Caleb could still hear the unmistakable crunch of footsteps, too close, too fast. Simon was ahead of him, his survival instincts kicking in as he led the way through the underbrush. Caleb was struggling to keep up. His legs were burning, the cold of the rain seeping through his clothes, but he couldn't stop. Not now. Not when he was so close to the truth. After what felt like an eternity of running, Simon stopped abruptly, his hand shooting up to signal Caleb to freeze. Caleb did so, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He barely had time to catch his breath before Simon pulled him behind a large tree, its trunk thick enough to offer some cover. Get down, Simon whispered, his voice urgent but calm. They crouched low, the rain running down their faces as they peered through the branches. Caleb's heart pounded in his chest as the sound of footsteps grew louder. Two men in black suits appeared at the edge of the clearing, their eyes scanning the area methodically. One of them held a rifle, the barrel glinting in the rain. They're looking for us, Caleb muttered, his voice tense. Simon nodded. And they won't stop until they find us. Caleb glanced over at Simon, confusion in his eyes. What do we do now? Simon's lips curled into a grim smile. We fight, but we do it smart. They don't know this forest as well as we do. The minutes stretched on in silence, and Caleb could feel the weight of the situation. These weren't just random thugs. They were professionals. Garrett's people had clearly been trained to track and eliminate threats. Caleb's mind raced, trying to think of a way out. Then, as if reading his thoughts, Simon spoke in a low voice. I've got an idea. We move west. There's an old abandoned cabin about half a mile from here. We'll use it as a staging point. Staging point for what? Caleb asked, confused. Simon didn't answer directly. Instead, he pointed to a nearby tree. See that low branch? If we climb it, we'll be able to get a better view of their movements. It'll give us the edge. Caleb hesitated for a moment, considering the danger of being spotted, but then nodded. All right, let's do it. Climbing up the tree, Caleb's heart pounded as he reached the low branch Simon had pointed out. From his vantage point, he could see the men clearly now. Both were moving cautiously, their eyes scanning the ground. They're splitting up, Caleb whispered. Simon, now crouched beside him on the branch, nodded. That's a mistake on their part. We'll take advantage of it. What do we do? Caleb asked, his hands shaking from the adrenaline coursing through his veins. Simon took a deep breath and surveyed the area. We wait. If they come close enough, we'll make our move. The cabin is just beyond the next hill, but we need to be sure they don't follow us. For several minutes, they waited in tense silence. Caleb's muscles were beginning to ache from the awkward position, but he didn't dare move. His eyes remained locked on the men below, watching their every step. One of the men was getting closer, moving toward their position. Caleb could feel the tension building, the threat of discovery hanging in the air like a razor-sharp blade. Suddenly, Simon's hand shot out, gripping Caleb's arm tightly. Move! Without thinking, Caleb dropped from the tree, landing in a crouch on the wet ground. Simon was already moving, taking off toward the west, and Caleb followed as fast as he could, his breath coming in ragged gasps. They ran through the thick forest, barely pausing for breath as they cut through the underbrush. Caleb's legs burned, but he pushed through the pain. He had no choice. The cabin was close. He could feel it. As they reached the clearing near the cabin, they stopped abruptly. The door to the dilapidated building creaked in the wind, and Caleb could hear the sound of footsteps growing closer. Inside now, Simon hissed. They sprinted toward the cabin, Simon already reaching for the door. Caleb glanced back one last time, his heart thumping. He couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. They made it inside just as the footsteps reached the clearing. Simon slammed the door shut behind them, and Caleb barely had time to catch his breath before Simon grabbed his shoulder. Stay low, stay quiet, Simon ordered. We need to figure out our next move. Fast. Caleb nodded, his pulse racing. The chase wasn't over yet, and now they were trapped. The sound of the engine revving up in the distance was like a warning bell, vibrating through Caleb's chest. His pulse quickened, every fiber of his being screaming to run. But Simon held up his hand, signaling for him to stay put. Stay quiet, Simon whispered, his voice steady despite the urgency of the moment. Caleb barely breathed, crouching low behind an old, cracked wooden table that was set up against the wall. The room was dim, shadows stretching across the floor from the few rays of light that pierced through the rotting wood. They had no weapons, no backup, just each other, their wits, and the knowledge that they had to survive. The sound of tires crunching on gravel sent a cold shiver down Caleb's spine. He couldn't tell how many people were in the car, but he knew it wasn't just one. His father's men were professional, methodical, and ruthless. The last thing he needed was to be outnumbered. Do you think they'll find us here? Caleb whispered, keeping his voice barely audible. Simon didn't answer immediately. He was staring out through a small crack in the cabin wall, watching the car that had stopped outside. His eyes narrowed, calculating every detail. They're circling the perimeter, Simon muttered. They'll search the area. But if they think we're still inside, they might get reckless. We need to make them think we've already gone. Caleb's mind raced. The only exit was the front door, and even if they managed to sneak out the back, there was no guarantee they wouldn't be spotted. The forest around them was dense, but the rain had slowed, and that made it easier for their pursuers to track them. Simon's hand shot out, gripping Caleb's shoulder tightly. Listen, we need a diversion. Something loud, something to draw their attention away from us. Do you have any ideas? Caleb shook his head, his mind blanking for a moment, but then it hit him. The old tools and supplies strewn about the cabin. It was a fire hazard waiting to happen. I can make a fire, Caleb said, his voice gaining confidence as the plan took shape in his mind. Not enough to burn the whole place down, but enough to get their attention. Simon's eyes flickered with approval. Good. We need to act fast. I'll go outside and create a distraction. You start the fire. Simon was gone in a flash, slipping out the door just as the sound of footsteps grew louder. Caleb's hands were trembling, but he forced himself to focus. He rummaged through the abandoned shelves, finding some old cans of gasoline and a box of matches. The smell of gasoline was overwhelming, but Caleb didn't hesitate. He splashed it around a pile of old rags and kindling near the back of the cabin. With one quick strike, the match flared to life, and he tossed it onto the pile. The fire ignited instantly, sending a plume of smoke rising into the air. Outside, Simon moved swiftly, ducking behind the thick trunk of a tree. He peered over his shoulder, watching the smoke billow up from the cabin. It wouldn't take long for the men outside to investigate. He could see their silhouettes moving closer, their eyes scanning for any signs of movement. It was now or never. Simon bolted from his hiding spot, sprinting toward a small ridge behind the cabin. He was fast, moving like a shadow, and he knew he had only one shot to pull this off. If he could get close enough to the men without being spotted, he'd have the upper hand. But the odds were slim. Back inside the cabin, Caleb felt his heart race as the fire grew, sending thick smoke into the air. He forced himself to focus, even as the cabin grew warmer and the smoke began to sting his eyes. The distraction was working. He could hear the shouts of the men outside, their voices growing frantic as they realized something was wrong. Caleb grabbed a heavy, rusted metal pipe from the corner of the room. It wasn't much, but it would have to do if they were going to fight their way out. He didn't know where Simon was, or if he was even still alive, but he had no choice but to trust him. The men had gathered near the front of the cabin, shouting orders to each other. Simon could hear them, but he didn't dare approach too closely. Instead, he crouched behind a boulder, eyes scanning for an opportunity to strike. The car was still parked a few yards away, its engine humming softly. If Simon could disable it, their chances of escaping would improve drastically. But how? He took a deep breath and focused. There was no room for hesitation. He had to act now. Simon moved quickly, slipping through the underbrush, his feet barely making a sound. He could see the men up ahead, their backs turned as they tried to figure out what was going on inside the cabin. The fire was growing, and the smoke was now thick enough to obscure their vision. With one swift motion, Simon darted toward the car, reaching underneath it to grab the exposed fuel line. His fingers were nimble, and with a sharp tug, he disconnected it, sending a stream of gasoline spilling onto the ground. He didn't have much time. Just as he was about to light the match, a voice rang out from behind him. "Hey, what the hell are you doing?" Simon froze, his heart skipping a beat. He spun around, meeting the cold eyes of one of Garrett's men. The man's rifle was raised, but Simon didn't hesitate. He lunged forward, knocking the rifle aside just as the man pulled the trigger. The gunshot rang out, but Simon was already on top of him, fist connecting with the man's jaw. The blow sent the man stumbling backward, but Simon didn't stop. He grabbed the rifle and swung it, knocking the man to the ground. Before Simon could react, two more men appeared, flanking him on either side. Inside the cabin, Caleb's heart was in his throat. He could hear the commotion outside, the sounds of struggle, and he knew that Simon was in trouble. He grabbed the pipe, his muscles screaming as he sprinted toward the door. The air was thick with tension, and Caleb's heart pounded in his chest as he stood frozen in the doorway. The rifle was pointed straight at him, the barrel gleaming menacingly in the fading light of the cabin. The man holding it didn't flinch, his eyes cold and unfeeling as they locked onto Caleb's. For a moment, it felt like time had stopped. The only sound was the crackle of the fire behind him, the smoke swirling up to the rafters. Caleb's fingers tightened around the pipe in his hands, his mind racing as he weighed his options. The man's finger began to tighten on the trigger. Caleb knew he didn't have much time, but just as the rifle's hammer clicked, a sharp yell rang out from behind him. "Caleb, move!" It was Simon. Caleb didn't have to think twice. He threw himself to the side, rolling across the floor just as the rifle shot rang out. The bullet missed him by inches, embedding itself in the wooden wall with a deafening crack. Caleb scrambled to his feet, his breath coming in ragged gasps as he sprinted toward the door. The man with the rifle was momentarily distracted, his eyes darting toward Simon, who was now charging at him from behind. Simon had no time to process the danger, only to act. He grabbed the nearest object, a piece of broken wood, and swung it with all his strength. The force of the blow landed squarely on the rifleman's arm, sending the weapon flying from his grasp. Caleb took advantage of the opening, charging forward with the pipe. He swung it with all his might, striking the man's legs and knocking him to the ground. The man let out a grunt of pain, but he quickly regained his footing, scrambling toward a nearby crate for cover. "Get down," Simon shouted, tackling Caleb to the ground just as another shot rang out. The bullet sailed harmlessly over their heads, but it was clear that the situation was deteriorating quickly. More footsteps approached from the surrounding trees, and Caleb could hear the voices of the other men growing louder. "We need to get out of here now," Caleb shouted, pushing Simon off him as he tried to stand. He could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on him. If they didn't escape, this could be their last stand. Simon nodded, his face grim as he scanned the area. He spotted the forest line just beyond the cabin, a narrow path leading into the dense woods. It was their only chance. "Follow me," Simon barked, leading the way toward the back of the cabin. They sprinted for the trees, Caleb's breath ragged as he ran as fast as his legs could carry him. But the men weren't far behind. Caleb could hear them shouting, their boots crashing through the underbrush as they chased after them. His legs burned, the ground beneath him turning slick with mud, but he didn't dare slow down. Simon led the way, ducking and weaving through the trees, always staying just ahead of Caleb. The sound of their pursuers was getting louder, and Caleb knew that if they didn't find cover soon, they'd be surrounded. Finally, Simon stopped, grabbing Caleb by the arm and pulling him toward a large boulder near the edge of a cliff. The view below was steep, and the drop was deadly, but it was the only hiding spot in sight. The two of them crouched behind the boulder, their bodies pressed close together, listening as the men closed in. Caleb's heart was still pounding in his chest. Sweat dripped down his face, mixing with the grime and dirt from the chase. The men were getting closer, and they were just about to pass the boulder. Simon looked at him, eyes wide with urgency. "We need a distraction. Now." Caleb glanced around, panic rising in his chest as the seconds ticked by. He spotted something, a rock, large enough to cause a noise when thrown. Without thinking, he grabbed it and hurled it toward the opposite side of the cliff. The rock landed with a loud crash, sending a shower of debris down the slope. The men immediately turned toward the noise, their attention diverted for just a moment. It was all the time Simon needed. He grabbed Caleb's arm and pulled him forward. "Move," Simon hissed, and they darted for cover, zigzagging through the trees as fast as they could. Their footsteps were muffled by the soft earth, and for a moment, it seemed like they might actually get away. But then, out of the corner of his eye, Caleb saw something that froze him in his tracks. One of Garrett's men, a massive figure dressed in dark clothes, was standing just ahead, blocking their path. Without warning, the man lunged toward them, his hand gripping a knife. Simon was the first to react, shoving Caleb out of the way and meeting the man head-on. The two collided with a thud, Simon's fist smashing into the man's jaw. Caleb stumbled back, eyes wide with fear. The man didn't go down. Instead, he swung the knife, narrowly missing Simon's side as he sidestepped. Caleb's mind raced. He had to do something. Fast. Instinctively, Caleb grabbed a branch from the ground, swinging it toward the attacker. The blow landed hard across the man's back, causing him to stagger forward. Simon took the opportunity, driving his elbow into the man's chest with brutal force. The man let out a grunt of pain but didn't fall. Instead, he growled and lunged forward again, this time with the knife raised high. The blade descended like a flash of lightning, sharp and merciless. Caleb's heart stopped in his chest as he watched it heading straight for Simon. Time seemed to slow, every detail sharp and terrifying. The gleam of steel, the sweat on Simon's brow, the determination in his eyes. Without thinking, Caleb acted. He grabbed the nearest object, a jagged rock from the ground, and hurled it toward the attacker. The rock hit the man square in the chest, knocking him off balance. The knife swung wildly through the air, missing Simon by inches as the attacker stumbled backward. Simon didn't hesitate. He spun on his heels, using his momentum to slam his elbow into the man's side, knocking him to the ground. Caleb rushed forward, grabbing the fallen knife and holding it with trembling hands. The moment felt surreal. The weight of the weapon in his grip, the burning adrenaline coursing through his veins. The man on the ground groaned, trying to push himself up, but Simon was quicker. He kicked the man's weapon from his hand and twisted his arm behind his back, forcing him to the dirt. "Stay down," Simon growled, his breath heavy. The attacker's body stiffened for a moment, then went limp, unable to fight back. Caleb stood over him, knife in hand, his breath ragged and shallow. His mind raced with disbelief. Had they really done it? Had they truly taken down one of Garrett's men? But there was no time to celebrate. More footsteps were approaching, growing louder by the second. "We need to move now," Caleb shouted, his eyes darting around the woods. The men would be upon them in minutes, and their options were running out. Simon nodded, his face grim as he yanked Caleb by the arm, pulling him into the thick trees. They didn't look back, knowing that if they did, they would only slow themselves down. They ran for what felt like hours, their legs aching and their breath coming in ragged gasps. The woods seemed endless, and every sound amplified the dread gnawing at Caleb's gut. Were they being followed? Was Garrett's crew on their tail, or had they managed to escape? Finally, Simon slowed his pace and gestured for Caleb to stop. They were far from the cabin now, deep into the forest. The sun had disappeared behind a thick blanket of clouds, and the only light was the faint glow of the moon through the trees. "We can't keep running forever," Simon said, his voice low but urgent. "We need a plan, and fast." Caleb glanced around, feeling the weight of the moment settle in. They were alone in the wilderness with a bunch of armed men hunting them. It wasn't just a matter of survival anymore. It was a matter of winning. "I have an idea," Caleb said, his mind starting to click into gear. "There's an old hunting cabin just a few miles west of here. It's off the map, hidden deep in the woods." "I know the way." Simon raised an eyebrow. "You sure?" "Positive," Caleb said, his voice steady despite the pounding in his chest. "We can take shelter there and regroup. We'll have the high ground. And maybe, just maybe, we can turn this around." Without waiting for a reply, Caleb set off in the direction he'd mentioned, pushing through the dense underbrush. Simon followed close behind, his silence speaking volumes. Caleb could feel the weight of his words, the burden of responsibility pressing on his shoulders. They had no other options, no other choice, but to make it to the cabin and prepare for whatever came next. The hours seemed to stretch on endlessly as they made their way through the thick forest, the terrain growing more treacherous with each step. The trees were dense here, the undergrowth thick and wild. Caleb had to navigate carefully, the path unfamiliar in the growing darkness. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, they emerged into a small clearing. There, in the middle of the space, stood the old hunting cabin, weathered, but still intact. "We're here," Caleb said, relief flooding his veins. Simon let out a breath, his tense shoulders relaxing for the first time in hours. But there was no time to rest. Caleb quickly approached the door, checking the area for any signs of life. The cabin had been abandoned for years, but Caleb had used it as a safe house on more than one occasion. It was the perfect spot to lay low, plan, and prepare for what was to come. As they entered, Caleb began to search the small, dusty cabin, pulling out old supplies that had been left behind. There were some basic rations, a few rusty tools, and a box of matches. It wasn't much, but it would have to do. Simon immediately began barricading the door, making sure no one could get in. "We need to prepare for what's coming," Caleb said as he went to the window, peering through a crack in the wall. "Garrett's men won't stop until they find us. But we can use the cabin to our advantage. We set traps, we fight smart. We've got this." Simon nodded, picking up a nearby piece of rope and tying it around a tree branch outside. It was their first step in setting up a perimeter, something that would give them a little extra time if the men came looking. Hours passed as they worked, each of them lost in the task at hand, the gravity of their situation weighing heavily on them. The darkness outside had deepened, and the air was thick with the smell of pine and damp earth. Caleb knew the men were closing in. Garrett was ruthless. He would never give up the chase. "Stay alert," Simon said, his voice tense. "They're coming. It's only a matter of time." Caleb's fingers clenched around a piece of wood, his mind racing. The first fight had been chaotic, but this was something else. The stakes had been raised. This wasn't just about survival anymore. This was war. The sound of footsteps grew louder, each step like a drumbeat in Caleb's chest. He could hear the crunch of dry leaves under boots, the soft rustling of branches as they were pushed aside. The night was alive with the approaching threat. Simon turned to Caleb, his expression grim. "They're here. We've got one shot at this." Caleb nodded, his grip tightening around the piece of wood in his hands. His mind raced, thinking back to the countless hours spent training, the countless scenarios in his head. He had never imagined it would come to this, fighting for his life, for everything he believed in the heart of the forest. But there was no turning back. "We fight smart. We'll use the traps. Let them come to us," Caleb said, his voice low but firm. Simon gave a curt nod and began making adjustments to the traps they'd set earlier. Ropes tied to branches, pitfalls hidden in the underbrush. Every move was calculated, every detail accounted for. Caleb stepped back to survey the area, checking their makeshift defenses. They had a few weapons, rusty knives, some old hunting rifles, but they were far from prepared for a full-scale assault. They would need to rely on their wits and quick thinking. The cabin door creaked as the wind picked up, adding to the tension. Caleb's heart beat faster, the adrenaline coursing through his veins. His eyes darted from one shadow to the next, searching for movement, waiting for the first sign of the enemy. The forest had grown eerily silent. Too silent. Then, it came. A figure emerged from the tree line, moving cautiously but with purpose. It was a man, dressed in camouflage, carrying a rifle. Caleb's eyes narrowed. This wasn't just one of Garrett's men. It was someone trained. Someone dangerous. Caleb motioned to Simon, and without a word, they both took position behind the cabin, out of sight. The man moved closer, his footsteps deliberate. He was searching for something, or someone. With a signal from Caleb, Simon quickly pulled a rope taut, triggering one of their traps. A loud snap echoed through the forest as the rope yanked a branch downward, causing a flurry of leaves and twigs to fall from above. The man froze, eyes darting around in confusion. Caleb's pulse quickened. He had only a split second to act. He stepped forward, the wood in his hand now raised like a weapon. But as he advanced, he saw movement to his left. Two more men had crept up, flanking him. The trap had worked, but it had drawn them in. They were surrounded. "Drop the weapon, kid," one of the men growled, his voice rough and laced with menace. He had a scar running down his cheek, and his eyes were cold, calculating. Caleb's heart raced, but he didn't back down. He couldn't. Not after everything that had happened. Not after all they'd fought for. The sound of footsteps grew louder, each step like a drumbeat in Caleb's chest. He could hear the crunch of dry leaves under boots, the soft rustling of branches as they were pushed aside. The night was alive with the approaching threat. Simon turned to Caleb, his expression grim. "They're here. We've got one shot at this." Caleb nodded, his grip tightening around the piece of wood in his hands. His mind raced, thinking back to the countless hours spent training, the countless scenarios in his head. He had never imagined it would come to this, fighting for his life, for everything he believed in the heart of the forest. But there was no turning back. "We fight smart. We'll use the traps. Let them come to us," Caleb said, his voice low but firm. Simon gave a curt nod and began making adjustments to the traps they'd set earlier. Ropes tied to branches, pitfalls hidden in the underbrush. Every move was calculated, every detail accounted for. Caleb stepped back to survey the area, checking their makeshift defenses. They had a few weapons, rusty knives, some old hunting rifles, but they were far from prepared for a full-scale assault. They would need to rely on their wits and quick thinking. The cabin door creaked as the wind picked up, adding to the tension. Caleb's heart beat faster, the adrenaline coursing through his veins. His eyes darted from one shadow to the next, searching for movement, waiting for the first sign of the enemy. The forest had grown eerily silent. Too silent. Then, it came. A figure emerged from the tree line, moving cautiously but with purpose. It was a man, dressed in camouflage, carrying a rifle. Caleb's eyes narrowed. This wasn't just one of Garrett's men. It was someone trained. Someone dangerous. Caleb motioned to Simon, and without a word, they both took position behind the cabin, out of sight. The man moved closer, his footsteps deliberate. He was searching for something, or someone. With a signal from Caleb, Simon quickly pulled a rope taut, triggering one of their traps. A loud snap echoed through the forest as the rope yanked a branch downward, causing a flurry of leaves and twigs to fall from above. The man froze, eyes darting around in confusion. Caleb's pulse quickened. He had only a split second to act. He stepped forward, the wood in his hand now raised like a weapon. But as he advanced, he saw movement to his left. 2 more men had crept up, flanking him. The trap had worked, but it had drawn them in. They were surrounded. "Drop the weapon, kid." One of the men growled, his voice rough and laced with menace. He had a scar running down his cheek, and his eyes were cold, calculating. Caleb's heart raced, but he didn't back down. He couldn't. Not after everything that had happened. Not after all they'd fought for. "Come any closer, and I'll make sure you never walk again," Caleb shot back, his voice steady despite the chaos in his head. Simon, silent and deadly, moved to Caleb's side, his eyes sharp as ever. "You're outnumbered," he said calmly, though there was a fire in his gaze. "But you don't have to die today. Walk away. This is your only chance." The men paused, considering the words, but only for a moment. One of them grinned, exposing a set of yellowed teeth. "You think we're afraid of you," he spat. "We've been sent for a reason, and we won't leave without finishing the job." The tension in the air was palpable, thick, and suffocating. Caleb's grip on the weapon tightened, the adrenaline beginning to flood his system. The first strike would determine everything. There was no more room for hesitation. The man lunged. It was fast, too fast for Caleb to fully process. But Simon was quicker. With a swift motion, Simon grabbed the man's wrist, twisting it violently. The man howled in pain, dropping his rifle. Caleb took his chance, swinging the piece of wood at the nearest attacker. It connected with a sickening crack, the man stumbling backward. The third man charged, but Caleb was already moving. He ducked low, sliding to the side and kicking the man's legs out from under him. The man hit the ground with a heavy thud, groaning in pain. But there was no time to pause. They weren't out of danger yet. Simon grabbed Caleb's arm, yanking him toward the cabin. "Move!" he shouted, urgency in his voice. They scrambled inside, slamming the door shut behind them just as the remaining attackers regrouped. Caleb's mind raced. They had the upper hand for now, but it wouldn't last. They needed a plan, and they needed it fast. "Get to the windows. Keep an eye out," Simon ordered. "I'll reinforce the door." Caleb quickly moved to one of the small, cracked windows, peering through the grime-covered glass. The 3 men were back on their feet, circling the cabin like predators, trying to find a way in. Their faces were full of rage, their weapons ready. Caleb's heart pounded in his chest, his palms slick with sweat. He knew Simon was right. They couldn't keep them at bay for long. The odds were stacked against them, and they were running out of time. Suddenly, Caleb's eyes narrowed as he saw something in the distance, a flicker of movement beyond the tree line. It wasn't just the 3 men anymore. More figures were emerging, several of them, closing in fast. They were trapped. "Simon, we've got company," Caleb said, his voice urgent. Simon froze, then turned to look out the window. His face darkened as he realized the situation. "Looks like we are not the only ones with backup," Simon muttered, his fingers tightening around a rifle. "Get ready." The cabin felt like a ticking time bomb. Caleb's heart pounded in his chest as he listened to the sound of footsteps circling, growing louder by the second. He glanced at Simon, who was staring out the window, his face grim, the rifle gripped tightly in his hands. They both knew that time was running out. The attackers weren't just close. They were about to strike. Caleb's mind raced. They were outnumbered, outgunned, and completely surrounded. The small, dilapidated cabin they were in might as well have been a death trap. They had no way out. No backup coming. It was just the two of them against a growing army of mercenaries and men willing to do whatever it took to silence them. "Get ready," Simon muttered, his voice low but urgent. He was already planning his next move, his eyes darting between the windows, looking for any weak points in their defense. He knew they couldn't hold them off for long, not with just the two of them. There was a sudden crash from the front of the cabin, a loud bang as one of the attackers hurled himself against the door, trying to break it down. The sound reverberated through the walls, and Caleb felt a chill run down his spine. They were coming. "We don't have much time," Caleb said, his voice tight. He moved toward the back of the cabin, eyeing the shadows beyond the window. "I'll cover the back. You keep them distracted up front." Simon nodded without hesitation. "Just stay alive," he said, his voice flat with determination. "We're not dying here tonight." The door buckled again, this time with more force. Caleb could see the hinges starting to strain, the wood splintering with every impact. There was no more time for strategy. They were about to be overrun. Suddenly, Caleb had an idea. Something crazy, something dangerous, but it was their only shot. He grabbed a small bottle of gasoline he had spotted earlier in the corner of the cabin. He knew it wasn't much, but it might just be enough to give them a fighting chance. He poured the gasoline across the floor in a quick, deliberate line, making sure to keep it away from anything that could catch fire prematurely. As he finished, he grabbed a match, his hand trembling slightly. He wasn't a violent man by nature, but in that moment, everything changed. This wasn't about survival anymore. It was about revenge. It was about ending this. The door gave way with one final push, sending splinters flying across the room. 3 men stormed into the cabin, their weapons raised, their eyes hungry for blood. Caleb didn't hesitate. Every step felt like a race against time. The fire behind them had given them a fleeting window, but the danger wasn't over. They were still in the heart of enemy territory, and Caleb could feel the weight of the night pressing in on him, the adrenaline from the previous battle beginning to fade. "Keep moving," Simon called over his shoulder, his voice sharp in the cold night air. "We're not out yet." They had been running for what felt like hours, but the forest seemed endless, the trees closing in around them like silent sentinels. Caleb's legs were starting to ache, and his chest burned from the smoke he had inhaled back at the cabin. But he didn't dare slow down. "Not now. Do you think they're still after us?" Caleb asked, his voice low as he wiped the sweat from his brow, even though the air was chill. Simon didn't respond immediately. He was listening, his sharp eyes scanning every movement in the shadows. The silence between them grew tense. Caleb could hear the distant sounds of the night, crickets chirping, the rustling of leaves, but nothing that would indicate they were being followed. Then, finally, Simon spoke. "They'll be looking for us," he said. "They won't stop until they find us. But we have a head start. That's what matters." Caleb nodded, his thoughts racing. They had to make it through the night, through the dense forest, and up to the ridge. Once there, they could try to figure out their next move. The problem was, they didn't know if they could make it in time. The ridge was their only chance to escape the immediate threat. If they could get there, they would be able to find cover, maybe even signal for help if they were lucky. But that was a big if. With every step they took, the risk grew. As they reached a small clearing, Simon suddenly stopped, holding up a hand to signal Caleb to do the same. His posture was rigid, his eyes narrowed in concentration. "Something's off," Simon murmured. He dropped to one knee, motioning for Caleb to do the same. Caleb crouched down beside him, trying to steady his breath, his heart hammering in his chest. There was nothing unusual about the clearing, but Simon's instincts were never wrong. "What is it?" Caleb whispered. "I don't know yet," Simon replied, his voice tense. "But we're not alone." Caleb strained his ears, listening for any sound that might explain Simon's warning. The wind rustled the trees, but other than that, it was eerily silent. And then, there it was, the faintest crack of a twig snapping underfoot, followed by a low rustle. It was subtle, but enough to send a chill down Caleb's spine. "Get ready," Simon said, his voice low but filled with command. He slowly reached for his rifle, eyes never leaving the dark tree line across the clearing. Caleb did the same, his hands trembling from the exhaustion and tension, but he forced himself to stay focused. They had been here before, always outnumbered, always under pressure. But this time felt different. This time, they weren't just fighting for survival. They were fighting to end this once and for all. A shape moved in the shadows, just at the edge of Caleb's vision. He tightened his grip on the rifle, ready to fire if needed. The figure stepped forward into the clearing, slowly, deliberately. And then Caleb saw him. Another man, dressed in dark clothing, a rifle slung across his back. He was alone, but the way he moved suggested he wasn't a stranger to the dangers of the night. He was calculating, cautious, and perhaps just as deadly as they were. But then, the man did something that caught Caleb completely off guard. He raised his hands slowly, in a gesture of peace, showing no intention to fight. "I'm not here to hurt you," the man said, his voice rough, but calm. Simon's grip on his rifle tightened. "Who are you?" he demanded, his voice colder than Caleb had ever heard it. The man lowered his hands slightly, his face becoming clearer in the dim light. He was older, perhaps in his mid-40s, with a weathered face and piercing eyes that seemed to assess everything around him in an instant. There was no mistaking the look of a man who had survived more than his share of battles. "I'm just trying to get out," the man said, his voice low but firm. "I've been tracking you for days. You've got bigger problems than me." Caleb and Simon exchanged a glance. There was something about the man that seemed familiar, but Caleb couldn't quite place it. "Bigger problems?" Caleb asked, his voice skeptical. The man nodded slowly. "You're not the only ones they're after. There's a lot more at stake than you realize. You need to trust me if you want to make it out alive." A silence hung between them, thick with tension. Caleb couldn't deny that the man's words struck a chord, but it wasn't in his nature to trust easily. And Simon certainly wasn't one to let his guard down for anyone, especially not now. "We don't need help," Simon finally said, his voice harsh, though the edge of doubt was starting to show. "We can handle ourselves." But the stranger wasn't backing down. "You don't have a choice. They've already started moving toward the ridge. And unless you want to walk into a trap, I suggest you listen to me." The man's words were a punch to the gut. Caleb knew Simon was right. They had to keep moving. But now there was a new complication. If this stranger was telling the truth, then the path ahead was even more dangerous than they had realized. But Simon was already thinking ahead. "All right," he said, his voice steady, though the distrust in his eyes was still there. "We'll hear you out. But one wrong move, and we'll finish this ourselves." The man gave a small nod. "Fair enough. But time is running out. Let's move." And just like that, the uneasy alliance was formed. The dark woods seemed to close in around them as they continued to move, the distant sound of the wind barely masking the eerie stillness that hung in the air. Caleb kept his eyes fixed on the figure of the man who had appeared out of nowhere, leading them deeper into the forest. Despite Simon's skepticism, Caleb couldn't help but feel a twinge of curiosity. The man had offered no explanation for why he was there, and yet there was something undeniably urgent about the way he spoke. It felt like they were being pulled toward something. But what? Simon wasn't fooled. His steps were purposeful, his rifle now held in front of him, eyes scanning the tree line with a practiced focus. Caleb could see the tension in his posture, the way his muscles were coiled like a spring, ready to react to any threat. He was the seasoned soldier, and Caleb was the younger, less experienced one. They had been through enough together to know that trust didn't come easily in their world. "We're close," the man said, his voice a rasp in the night air. He didn't turn to look at them as he spoke, his eyes fixed on the path ahead. "I've been tracking them for days. They've set up camp near the ridge. We need to reach it before they do." Simon's grip on his rifle tightened, but he didn't respond immediately. Caleb knew what he was thinking. Could they trust this man? Was he really trying to help, or was he leading them into an even worse situation? "Who are they?" Caleb asked, his voice steady despite the growing unease. "And why should we trust you?" The man hesitated, his eyes flicking to Caleb for a brief moment before returning to the path ahead. He seemed to weigh his words carefully, as though deciding how much to reveal. "They're the same people who've been hunting you," he said finally. "But they're not just after you. They're after something much bigger. I've seen them operate before. They'll stop at nothing to get what they want." Caleb felt a chill crawl down his spine. Who were these people? What were they after? The uncertainty gnawed at him, and the more the man spoke, the more questions he had. They had come so far already, and yet they were no closer to understanding the full scope of the danger they faced. "How do you know all this?" Simon demanded, his voice sharp. "Why should we believe you?" The man slowed his pace, finally turning to face them. In the dim light of the forest, Caleb could see his face more clearly. It was weathered, scarred, as if he had seen his fair share of battles, both physical and mental. There was a haunted look in his eyes, and for a moment, Caleb thought he saw something. Regret, perhaps? But it was gone in an instant, replaced by a steely resolve. "I've been in the same fight," the man said quietly. "I've crossed paths with these people before. They don't stop. They'll come for you, your families, anyone who gets in their way. I've seen it happen." The gravity of the man's words hung heavy in the air, and Caleb couldn't shake the feeling that he was telling the truth. They weren't just fighting for their lives. They were fighting against something far more insidious, something with far-reaching consequences. Suddenly, there was a rustle in the trees, followed by the unmistakable sound of footsteps, too many to be just an animal. Caleb's heart rate spiked, and he instinctively dropped to a crouch, rifle raised. Simon's eyes were scanning the darkness, his body poised for action. The man, however, remained calm. His gaze didn't flicker, but Caleb could see the faintest glimmer of concern in his eyes. He had heard it too. "Stay low," the man whispered, his voice a harsh whisper. "They're close." A chill swept through Caleb as the sound grew louder, closer. The shadows of the trees seemed to shift and move, as though the forest itself was alive with hidden danger. He strained his ears, trying to pinpoint the source of the sound, but everything around him seemed to shift in the dark. And then, suddenly, a figure stepped out of the darkness. It was a man, tall, broad-shouldered, dressed in tactical gear, his face obscured by a mask. He moved with the quiet precision of someone who had been trained for this exact moment. Caleb's pulse raced. This was no random encounter. This was the enemy. The figure paused, scanning the clearing with sharp eyes. He didn't see them. Not yet. Caleb held his breath, praying the wind wouldn't shift. The tension in the air was thick enough to cut with a knife. The stranger had stopped at the edge of the clearing, his posture relaxed, but Caleb knew better. This was a man on high alert, just as they were. He was looking for something, or someone. Simon's grip on his rifle tightened. Caleb could see the determination in his eyes. Simon was ready to engage, but the man in the clearing hadn't made a move yet. Then, to Caleb's shock, the man in the clearing spoke, his voice low but clear. "You're not alone. I know you're out there." Caleb's heart stopped. Had they been spotted? Was this the end? But before he could react, the stranger raised a hand, signaling for them to stay hidden. "I'm not here to fight," the man said, his voice cold and calm. "But I'm not going to let you leave either." Simon motioned for Caleb to stay still. His eyes narrowed as he watched the man closely. The situation was spiraling quickly. They couldn't trust anyone now, not even this stranger. The silence was deafening as the two sides faced off across the clearing, neither side moving. Caleb's mind raced. Should they shoot? Should they retreat? And then, the sound of more footsteps behind them. Another figure emerged from the shadows. The sound of footsteps behind them echoed louder now, unmistakable and coming fast. Caleb's heart raced as he turned, scanning the shadows where the noise had originated. Another figure emerged from the trees, moving swiftly with the same calculated precision as the first. Caleb's gut twisted. There was no mistaking it now. They were surrounded. Simon didn't hesitate. He raised his rifle, leveling it toward the newcomer with a grim expression. Caleb followed his lead, instinctively taking a defensive stance, his finger hovering over the trigger. The forest was eerily silent now, as if holding its breath. The new figure stepped into the clearing, a woman this time. dressed in tactical gear like the others. She wasn't as tall as the man, but there was something about her presence that made Caleb's skin prickle. She moved with the same fluid grace, but there was a coldness in her eyes that made her seem more dangerous than the man. "Lower your weapons," she called out in a commanding voice, her tone devoid of any fear. "You won't win this fight." Caleb's grip tightened on his rifle, his instinct screaming at him to fire first, ask questions later. But Simon held his position, never taking his eyes off her, and after a long moment, he slowly lowered his weapon. Caleb followed suit, but every muscle in his body screamed to do the opposite. The woman smiled, but there was no warmth in it, just the barest hint of amusement. "Smart choice," she said. "But don't think for a second that it means you're safe." Caleb's mind was racing. Who were these people? What were they after? And more importantly, why had they let them live this long? "You've been tracking us," Simon said, his voice low but steady. "What's your game?" The woman's gaze flicked to the man standing across from them. "Same as his," she said, her voice barely a whisper now. "We're not here for you. Not yet." Caleb's eyes narrowed, confusion washing over him. What did she mean by that? They weren't here for them yet? It was as if the danger they were facing was only just beginning. "I don't buy it," Simon said, his voice growing more tense. "You think we'll just follow you into whatever trap you're setting?" The woman's expression hardened. "If I wanted you dead, you'd already be," she said flatly. "I'm offering you a choice. You can come with us, or you can die here. There's no middle ground. Not anymore." Caleb exchanged a quick glance with Simon. The words hung heavily in the air. There was no room for negotiation. They had no choice. They could either risk trusting these people or face an unknown enemy that would stop at nothing to eliminate them. And yet, something gnawed at Caleb. His instincts told him not to trust them, but the voice inside his head told him they didn't have much of a choice. The stakes were too high. Simon let out a slow breath, lowering his rifle completely. "We'll go," he said, his voice laced with skepticism. "But you better explain yourself. And don't think for a second, we won't make you regret this if it turns out you're leading us into a trap." The woman nodded curtly, the faintest smirk tugging at the corner of her mouth. "Fair enough," she said. "But remember, the clock is ticking. You're not the only ones who've been marked." With that, she turned and began walking back toward the woods, the man following behind her without a word. Caleb and Simon exchanged one last wary glance before reluctantly following in their wake. The deeper they ventured into the forest, the more Caleb's unease grew. The shadows seemed to grow longer, stretching out like hands, ready to grab them at any moment. Every step felt heavier, as if the weight of the unknown was pressing down on them from all sides. As they walked, the woman led them with quiet confidence, weaving through the trees as if she knew this land better than her own skin. The man remained silent, his eyes scanning their surroundings with a sharp intensity, clearly alert for any signs of danger. Caleb couldn't help but wonder how much they truly knew about the danger they were facing, or if they were just as lost as he and Simon. Finally, after what felt like hours of tense silence, they reached a clearing. In the center of it was a small campfire, barely more than a flicker in the growing darkness. The woman stopped abruptly, turning to face them. "Here we are," she said. "Rest. We'll need you at full strength for what comes next." Simon didn't sit. He stood a few feet from the fire, his posture rigid, still on edge. Caleb, however, felt the exhaustion from the day's events wash over him. He sank to the ground near the fire, the warmth of the flames a welcome comfort. But as soon as he sat, the weight of the situation crashed down on him once more. "What now?" he asked, his voice low. The woman stared into the fire for a long moment before responding. "Now, you learn who's been hunting you and why." Her words hung heavy in the air, and for a moment, the campfire crackled with an uneasy silence. Caleb's mind raced, trying to piece together the puzzle of their situation. Who was behind all this? And why had they been targeted? "You've been running from them for a reason," she continued, her voice calm but laden with something darker. "They've been pulling strings for a long time, and you're only part of the bigger picture. But trust me, if you don't fight back now, there won't be a tomorrow." Caleb's thoughts were interrupted by the sound of a twig snapping underfoot. He tensed, his hand instinctively reaching for his rifle, but the woman raised a hand to stop him. "It's them," she said softly. "Get ready." The footsteps were unmistakable now. They weren't just a few stragglers. They were a full-on unit. Caleb's heart pounded in his chest as he stood, his hand gripping his rifle tightly. His eyes scanned the woods, trying to pick out any movement, any clue that would tell him what they were up against. His instincts screamed at him to prepare for the worst, and he wasn't about to ignore them. The woman, who had introduced herself as Mara, had already taken cover behind a thick tree trunk, her rifle ready and her eyes fixed on the darkening woods. The man, whose name Caleb still didn't know, was crouched low, his posture poised and ready for action. Simon stood beside Caleb, his own weapon raised. The campfire flickered erratically, casting long shadows that seemed to dance ominously around them. "Get ready," Mara whispered, her voice steady despite the tension. "They found us." Caleb's stomach twisted. Who were these people, and how had they known exactly where to find them? What was this group they were up against, and why were they being hunted so relentlessly? The sounds of the approaching unit grew louder, and then, from the shadows, they emerged. Figures clad in black, tactical gear, their faces hidden behind masks, moved with deadly precision. There were at least 6 of them, maybe more, their weapons raised and aimed in their direction. The flashlights from their rifles cut through the darkness, illuminating the trees and creating an almost blinding contrast with the dim firelight. Caleb's breath caught in his throat. This wasn't a random encounter. This was an organized, deliberate assault. Mara shifted slightly, her eyes narrowing as she scanned the enemy soldiers. "These aren't just mercenaries," she muttered, barely audible over the sounds of the forest. "These are the Blackhawk Syndicate. They've been hunting us for months." Caleb's stomach dropped. The name was familiar. He'd heard whispers about the Blackhawk Syndicate, an underground network of mercenaries, arms dealers, and shadow operatives. They were ruthless, and they never stopped until they got what they wanted. If they were after him and Simon, things were far worse than they'd realized. "Who the hell are they after?" Caleb asked, his voice tight. Mara didn't answer immediately. Her focus was on the approaching group, her face set in a hard, determined expression. Then, she turned to Caleb, her eyes meeting his. "They're after me, but you two are caught in the middle." "I'm sorry." Caleb's pulse quickened. They'd been drawn into something far bigger than they could have ever imagined, and now they had no way out. Simon's grip on his rifle tightened as he surveyed the incoming threat. "So, what do we do? We can't just sit here and wait for them to take us down." Mara's expression darkened. "We fight. There's no other option." The sound of gunfire shattered the stillness of the night. A sharp crack echoed through the forest, and before Caleb could even react, a bullet whizzed past him, narrowly missing his shoulder. The ambush had begun. Without thinking, Caleb dropped to the ground, taking cover behind a large boulder. The other mercenaries were already returning fire, their shots lighting up the trees with deadly precision. Caleb's pulse was thundering in his ears, but his training kicked in. He focused on his breathing, steadying himself, and checked his rifle. He could do this. They had to survive. "Move!" Mara shouted, her voice cutting through the chaos. She darted from cover to cover, her movements swift and graceful as she fired off a few well-placed shots. Her companions were equally skilled, responding in kind to the attackers with controlled bursts of fire. The forest was now alive with the sharp staccato of gunshots and the low hum of adrenaline. Caleb and Simon followed her lead, popping up from behind cover long enough to return fire, always mindful of the positions they were exposed in. Caleb could see the mercenaries beginning to circle around them, trying to flank their position. They were outnumbered, but Caleb had learned long ago that numbers didn't always matter if you had the right strategy. "We need to get out of here," Caleb yelled, his voice barely audible over the gunfire. "This is a trap." Simon looked back at him, his face grim. "No argument there. But if we run, they'll hunt us down like animals. We fight, or we die." Mara's voice came through again, more urgent this time. "He's right. There's no running now. We make our stand here. Trust me, I've got a plan." Caleb's eyes locked onto hers for a split second, and he saw a flash of something he hadn't expected: desperation. Mara wasn't just trying to survive. She was trying to lead them out of this alive. He nodded to her, though he wasn't sure if he believed her or not. They didn't have time to debate it now. The firefight intensified, the air thick with the acrid smell of gunpowder. Caleb's mind raced as he fired shot after shot, focusing on the mercenaries that were moving to surround them. He could feel the pressure mounting, the weight of the situation threatening to crush him, but he couldn't let it. He wouldn't. Mara ducked behind a fallen tree, her rifle raised as she fired at one of the enemy soldiers who had attempted to move in on their left flank. With a sharp, precise shot, the soldier dropped, his body crumpling to the ground. Caleb didn't have time to wonder about the fate of the man. There was still a battle to be fought. Suddenly, a loud explosion shook the ground beneath them. Caleb's ears rang from the blast, and for a moment, everything went white. The shockwave of the explosion sent debris flying in all directions, and Caleb was thrown to the ground, his rifle clattering from his hands. For a moment, everything was a blur of smoke and confusion. Caleb shook his head, trying to clear the ringing from his ears. He could hear shouting now, but it was distant. Was it Simon calling to him? Mara? Or was it someone from the enemy team? When his vision cleared, he saw a group of mercenaries advancing on their position. This was it. They had no choice but to make their stand, or it would all be over. The sound of their breath was all Caleb could hear now, shallow, quick, and panicked. The explosion had sent him reeling, but the fight wasn't over. He could feel the heat from the blast still radiating in the air, mixing with the cold night wind that swept through the trees. The mercenaries were closing in. They'd lost their cover, and they couldn't afford to wait any longer. "Stay down." Mara's voice sliced through the haze of confusion. She was crouched beside a thick tree, her hands on her rifle, eyes scanning the darkened perimeter. She looked every bit the part of the hunted and the hunter, and Caleb wasn't sure if that made him feel safer or more terrified. Simon, beside him, was checking his weapon with frantic motions. "We can't keep this up much longer. We need to move." Caleb nodded, even though he had no idea where they could possibly go. The only way out of this was forward, and that was exactly what the mercenaries were counting on. They were smart. If they'd set a trap, they wouldn't be leaving any openings. "We're not running," Mara said through gritted teeth. "We fight. I have one shot at this, but it's risky. If it works, we'll have a chance." Caleb looked over at her, his heart hammering. "What's the plan?" Mara held up a small, dark device in her hand. It looked like something out of a spy movie, compact and deadly. "EMP. It'll short-circuit their equipment for a few seconds, just long enough for us to take them down or make a run for it. It's all or nothing." She was right. They were at a crossroads. If they didn't take a gamble now, they'd be surrounded and picked off one by one. "What's the catch?" Caleb asked, already knowing the answer. "Timing," Mara replied. "If we don't trigger it right, we're toast." Caleb didn't hesitate. He didn't have a choice. They couldn't stay trapped in the woods forever. "Do it." Mara nodded sharply, and for a moment, everything fell silent. The sound of the wind rustling through the trees, the crackling of the fire they'd left behind, and the distant footsteps of the mercenaries were the only things filling the air. Caleb felt the weight of the moment settle on his shoulders. He could hear his pulse in his ears, and his muscles tensed as he prepared for what was to come. Then, without warning, Mara pressed the button. The world seemed to stop for a split second. Caleb's heart skipped a beat as a high-pitched whine echoed through the forest. His eyes widened, and he watched as the mercenaries' lights flickered and then went out, their communications static, their movements stuttering. The EMP had done its job, but they only had seconds. Caleb's mind was already in motion. He picked up his rifle and bolted from behind his cover, moving faster than he'd ever thought possible. His instinct screamed at him to stay low, to keep moving, to find the next piece of cover. The mercenaries were reorienting themselves, but the momentary blackout had bought them precious seconds. He heard Simon yell and saw him sprinting in the opposite direction, a flash of motion in the darkness. Mara was right beside Caleb, her eyes fierce with determination. "We take them now," she shouted. Caleb didn't hesitate. He raised his rifle and fired. The first shot hit a mercenary square in the chest, and the man crumpled to the ground in a lifeless heap. Caleb's heart raced with the sudden burst of action, but there was no time to savor the victory. Another soldier appeared from behind a tree, his rifle raised and aimed directly at Mara. Caleb didn't think. He squeezed the trigger, sending another shot into the mercenary's shoulder. The man dropped, screaming in pain as he hit the ground. But it wasn't enough. More soldiers were closing in. They were faster now, adapting to the loss of their technology. Their tactics were sharp, and they didn't seem to care about the casualties. They were here to finish the job. Simon had already moved into position behind a massive rock, returning fire with precision. Caleb and Mara kept moving, shifting their position as fast as they could. They needed to break the perimeter, get out of the kill zone. But then a sharp voice rang out, cutting through the chaos. "Stop!" It was an order, clear and commanding, and it came from someone Caleb hadn't seen before. Taller, broader than the rest, with an unsettling calmness in his demeanor. He wasn't wearing a mask like the others. His face was visible, cold and unreadable. He had a scar that ran down the side of his face, and his eyes locked onto Caleb with a predatory gaze. "I'm not here for you," the man said, his voice like gravel. "I'm here for her." Caleb felt the hairs on the back of his neck rise. Mara's face twisted with a mix of anger and fear as she raised her rifle. "If you think I'm just going to walk away with you, you're insane." The man's lips curled into a smirk. "I'm not asking." Without warning, he gestured, and the remaining mercenaries moved in closer, boxing them in from all sides. Caleb's blood ran cold. There was no more fight left in them now. They were surrounded. But then Mara's eyes flicked to Caleb, and in that moment, Caleb knew exactly what she was planning. She wasn't about to give up. She had one last trick up her sleeve, and it wasn't just a fight for survival. This was personal. Caleb's mind raced. He knew the risks, but he couldn't let her do it alone. The forest had fallen eerily silent, except for the quick, shallow breaths of Caleb, Mara, and Simon. The mercenaries had them surrounded, and the leader, still standing with that cold, calculating expression, didn't seem to be in any hurry. He knew they were cornered. He knew they had nowhere to run. But Mara's eyes never left him. Despite the encroaching danger, there was a fire in her gaze, a glint of something far more dangerous than fear. She wasn't just fighting for survival anymore. No, Mara had a deeper motive, one that Caleb hadn't fully understood yet. The leader tilted his head slightly. "You're not fooling anyone," he said, his voice low and steady. "You know exactly what's at stake here. This is bigger than you." Caleb's pulse quickened. There was an underlying threat in the leader's words, something that spoke of history and unfinished business, but it wasn't just about them. It was about Mara. Mara's fingers tightened around her rifle, but she didn't respond. Instead, she lowered it slowly, as if considering her options. For a moment, it looked like she was surrendering, but Caleb knew better. Something in her posture had shifted, as if she were preparing to spring. The leader didn't lower his guard. He watched Mara intently, as if waiting for her to make the first move. But it wasn't a question of if anymore. It was a question of when. Caleb felt it in the pit of his stomach, the cold certainty that this moment was inevitable. Finally, Mara spoke. Her voice was calm, but it carried an undeniable weight. "I'm not here for your mercy," she said, her words hanging in the still air. "I'm here for something much more important." The leader's eyes narrowed. "You don't get to decide that. You never did." At that moment, everything seemed to move in slow motion. Caleb watched as Mara's hand, still clutching her rifle, slowly shifted away from the weapon and reached for something at her side. Her fingers brushed against a small, metal device, just like the EMP device she'd used earlier. Caleb's breath caught in his throat. He had no idea what it was, but he knew Mara had a plan. And whatever it was about to unfold in front of them. Without warning, Mara threw the device into the air. The leader's eyes widened just as it detonated. The explosion was deafening, a burst of light that blinded Caleb for a split second. The mercenaries around them were thrown off their feet, and the leader's cold smirk faltered for the briefest of moments. But Caleb didn't wait. He dove for cover, dragging Simon with him. The mercenaries were disoriented, scrambling to recover, and Mara was already in motion. She didn't waste any time. She knew this was her one chance to end it all. "Caleb, move!" Mara shouted. He didn't need to be told twice. Caleb sprang from his hiding spot, running toward Mara as fast as he could. She was already several paces ahead, weaving between the trees with a speed that took Caleb by surprise. Simon followed closely behind, but it was clear that they couldn't afford to stop or hesitate. The mercenaries were regaining their composure, but it was too late. Mara was already too far ahead, and the remaining soldiers were scattered. For the first time, they had the upper hand. But as Caleb pushed forward, something gnawed at him. There was a disconnect in the way Mara was moving, a sense of urgency that wasn't just about escaping the mercenaries. It was about something else, something personal. He caught up to her, just as she reached the edge of the forest. She was panting, her face set in a grim expression. "Where are we going?" Caleb asked, breathless. Mara didn't answer at first. She looked over her shoulder, watching the mercenaries' movements carefully. The distance between them was increasing, but they weren't out of danger yet. "You need to know the truth, Caleb," she said, her voice tight with emotion. "And I don't have time to sugarcoat it anymore." Caleb's confusion deepened. The truth about what? Mara's face hardened as she looked straight ahead, eyes fixed on something Caleb couldn't see. "About why they're after me. About why this fight isn't just about survival, it's about revenge. I'm not running from them, Caleb. I'm running to them." Caleb stopped in his tracks, his heart skipping a beat. "What do you mean? What are you talking about?" She met his eyes, and for the first time, Caleb saw the raw pain in her gaze. "I've been tracking them for years. These mercenaries, they aren't just soldiers. They're part of something bigger, something I've been trying to expose for a long time. But every time I get close, they cover their tracks." Caleb's mind raced. This wasn't just some simple escape mission. There was more to Mara than he'd realized, more that she hadn't shared. He had no idea how deep this went. "I can't let them keep covering it up," Mara continued, her voice low. "And I can't let them hurt anyone else. It's not just about me anymore. It never was." Caleb felt a surge of understanding, of resolve. He didn't know what Mara's past held, but he knew one thing for sure. She wasn't going to stop until she took them down. And if she was going to face this war, he wasn't going to let her do it alone. "We're with you," Simon said, his voice firm and unwavering. Mara nodded, but there was a flicker of doubt in her eyes. "I hope you're ready for what's coming. Because once we go after them, there's no turning back." The tension in the air was thick, suffocating. They had moved quickly, following the winding path through the forest that Mara knew all too well, but Caleb couldn't shake the feeling that they were walking into a trap. Every instinct in his body screamed at him to turn back, but Mara's unwavering resolve kept them moving forward. Mara had barely spoken since they left the clearing, her expression tight and unreadable. Caleb could feel the weight of her silence pressing down on them, as if the whole world was waiting for her to say something. Anything. But it wasn't until they reached a small clearing in the trees, where the moonlight broke through the canopy in stark beams, that she finally stopped. "We're close," she murmured, glancing over her shoulder to make sure Simon and Caleb were still following. Caleb nodded, his hand instinctively resting on the handle of his sidearm. He'd been in too many dangerous situations to feel completely comfortable, even now, with the mercenaries scattered behind them. But there was something different about this mission. Something that gnawed at him deep in his gut. Something personal. "What's the plan?" Simon asked, his voice low but steady. His eyes flicked to Mara, awaiting direction. Mara didn't hesitate. She dropped to one knee, pulling out a small, folded map from her pack. She spread it out on the ground, using a rock to weigh down the corners. Caleb and Simon crouched beside her, peering over the map. "There's a compound up ahead," Mara said, pointing to a cluster of buildings marked on the map. "It's heavily guarded, but it's where we'll find answers." Caleb studied the map, his brow furrowing. He could see the tracks leading up to the compound, several of them, likely from different vehicles. If there was one thing Caleb knew, it was that the compound wouldn't be easy to breach. "Answers about what, exactly?" Caleb asked, his voice just above a whisper. Mara's eyes flicked up to meet his, the intensity in her gaze sending a shiver down his spine. Answers about who's pulling the strings, who's funding the mercenaries. This goes deeper than I thought. The people behind this aren't just trying to wipe us out. They're trying to control the narrative. And I'm not going to let that happen. Simon stood up and checked the clip of his rifle. Sounds like a suicide mission, he muttered, half to himself. Mara didn't flinch at his words. I've been on worse, she replied quietly. And this isn't about survival anymore. It's about exposing them. We don't stop until we bring them to their knees. There was a deadly finality in her tone that Caleb hadn't heard before. Mara wasn't just fighting for justice. She was fighting for something much more personal, and that scared him. Without waiting for further discussion, Mara stood and folded the map back into her pack. She motioned for them to follow and began moving in the direction of the compound. Caleb and Simon exchanged uneasy glances, but they both followed her lead. There was no turning back now. The closer they got to the compound, the more Caleb's senses sharpened. The shadows around them seemed to grow thicker, and the sounds of the night, rustling leaves, the distant calls of animals, grew muffled, drowned out by the soft thud of their boots on the ground. Every movement felt calculated, as if the forest itself was holding its breath. As they reached the outskirts of the compound, Mara motioned for them to stop. They crouched low behind a large cluster of rocks and surveyed the scene. The compound was nestled in a valley, surrounded by high fences topped with barbed wire. Guard towers stood at each corner, their searchlights sweeping across the ground in slow, methodical arcs. They've got to be watching for us, Caleb whispered, his eyes scanning the perimeter. Mara nodded, her face tight with determination. They will be. But we've got one advantage. They won't expect us to approach from the west. There's a gap in the fence there. Caleb followed her gaze, spotting the small opening between two sections of the chain-link fence. It was narrow, just wide enough for them to squeeze through if they were careful. But it wouldn't be easy. And once we're inside? Caleb asked, his heart pounding in his chest. Once we're inside, we find their command center. It'll be the only place with any kind of useful information. From there, we take out their leaders, Mara said. Her voice was steely, unwavering. If we can hit them where it hurts, the whole operation crumbles. The plan was reckless, Caleb knew that. But it was the only plan they had, and if there was anyone who could pull it off, it was Mara. Without another word, Mara gestured for them to move. They began to move swiftly and silently, hugging the shadows as they made their way toward the gap in the fence. The air was thick with anticipation, and Caleb's heart hammered in his chest. Each step seemed to echo louder than the last, and he had to remind himself to breathe, to stay focused. They reached the gap in the fence without incident, and Mara led the way through first, followed by Caleb and Simon. They crouched low to the ground, their eyes darting to the guard towers above them. The searchlights were dangerously close, but they hadn't been spotted yet. Once they were inside the compound, the true scope of the operation became clear. The buildings were massive, several stories high, and the grounds were heavily fortified. But there was no turning back now. Mara led them toward the center of the compound, moving with purpose, her every step calculated. Suddenly, a shout pierced the silence. Stop right there. Caleb spun around, instinctively reaching for his sidearm. A group of mercenaries had spotted them, their guns raised and aimed directly at Mara, Caleb, and Simon. The compound was no longer a silent fortress. They had been discovered. The air was electric with tension, thick with the weight of impending danger. The mercenaries had encircled them, their weapons aimed with deadly precision. Caleb's fingers tightened around the grip of his sidearm, his breath shallow as his mind raced. Mara's face remained calm, her eyes flicking quickly to the mercenaries and back to the gap in the fence they had just passed through. She wasn't showing fear, but Caleb could see the calculation in her gaze. She was already thinking ahead, weighing their options. One of the mercenaries, a tall man with a scar running down his face, stepped forward, a smirk playing at the corner of his lips. You really thought you could sneak in here, he sneered. You've got guts, I'll give you that. Mara didn't flinch. This is your last chance to walk away, she said, her voice cold and controlled. I'm not here to fight. I'm here for answers. The man with the scar scoffed, shaking his head. Answers? From us? His eyes narrowed. You're about to be part of the story we're telling, lady. And trust me, it's not one you'll want to remember. Before anyone could react, Mara moved. She dropped to the ground, her body rolling to the side as she pulled a flashbang grenade from her vest. She hurled it in the direction of the mercenaries, and within seconds, a blinding light filled the compound. The deafening explosion followed immediately, sending the mercenaries stumbling backward, their hands instinctively going to their eyes. Caleb didn't hesitate. He bolted forward, gun drawn, covering Mara as she moved swiftly to her feet. The smoke from the flashbang swirled around them, providing just enough cover to make their advance. Simon followed close behind, his rifle raised, scanning the perimeter for any threats. Move, Mara barked. They darted through the chaos, heading straight for the heart of the compound. The mercenaries were still recovering, but they wouldn't be down for long. Caleb's pulse was hammering in his ears as he followed Mara's lead, trusting her instincts completely. They reached the building's side, where a large metal door stood slightly ajar, just enough to slip through. Mara pushed it open slowly, peeking inside. The interior was dark, but there were faint lights glowing in the distance, the hum of machinery buzzing in the air. She motioned for them to follow her in, and they slipped through the door, entering the heart of the operation. Inside, it was eerily quiet. The halls were lined with steel doors, some with bars, others locked tight. The walls were cold and industrial, but there was something more sinister about this place, something that gnawed at Caleb's gut. This wasn't just a compound for mercenaries. This was where decisions were made, where strategies were developed, and lives were destroyed. They moved silently through the hallways, Mara leading them with her knowledge of the layout. Her eyes were sharp, her every movement calculated. She was a force of nature, her mission clear, and Caleb could feel the weight of her resolve. "Where are we going?" Simon asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "To the command center," Mara replied. "It's down the hall. We'll find what we need there." They reached a door at the end of the hall, and Mara checked the handle. It was locked, but not for long. She took a small device from her vest, a high-tech electronic lockpick, and in seconds, the door clicked open. They entered the room, and Caleb's eyes immediately scanned the space. It was a large control center, filled with monitors and computers, all displaying data and live footage from around the compound. At the center of it all was a large desk, where a man sat, hunched over a series of documents. He didn't notice them enter. Mara didn't waste a second. She moved quickly, her footsteps barely making a sound on the concrete floor. Without warning, she grabbed the man by the collar of his shirt, pulling him backward out of his seat and slamming him against the desk. The man's eyes widened, his mouth opening in surprise, but he didn't have time to scream. Mara's voice was icy as she leaned in, her face inches from his. "Tell me who's running this operation," she demanded. "Now." The man's breath hitched, and for a moment, Caleb thought he might try to fight back. But then, the panic in his eyes gave way to a resigned look, as if he had already made peace with his fate. "You'll never stop them," the man spat, his voice trembling. "It's bigger than you think. Bigger than this. They'll destroy you, just like they've destroyed everyone else." Mara's grip tightened. "Who is behind this?" The man's gaze flicked to the monitors behind him. "You'll find what you're looking for on those screens," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "But you'll regret it. They'll come for you." Mara didn't hesitate. She shoved him aside and turned toward the monitors, her eyes scanning the data. Caleb stepped forward, glancing over her shoulder. The screens displayed a series of coded messages, intel on various operations around the world, places Caleb recognized, people he had known, missions he had once been a part of. But one thing caught his eye, a name. A name he never expected to see. It was his own. His heart skipped a beat. Before he could process what this meant, the door to the control center slammed open, and more mercenaries flooded in, guns drawn. There was no time left. "We're out of time," Mara said, her voice cold and calculating. "Get ready for a fight." The room erupted into chaos. The heavy thud of boots reverberated through the walls as mercenaries poured in from every direction. Caleb's heart was racing, his senses on high alert as he drew his sidearm, taking position beside Mara. She was already moving, her sharp eyes scanning for the quickest escape route. "Get to the exit," Mara barked, her voice firm and commanding. "We need to get out now." The mercenaries were closing in fast, and Caleb's mind spun. The name on the screen, his name, had thrown him off balance for a split second. But now, the reality of the situation hit him. This wasn't just about survival anymore. This was about the truth, about the connection that was far deeper than he ever expected. Mara fired first, her shots precise and controlled, dropping the nearest mercenary in his tracks. Caleb followed her lead, his aim steady despite the adrenaline pumping through his veins. They made their way toward the back of the room, where a narrow hallway led to another door. But before they could reach it, a voice called out from behind them. "Don't even think about it." Caleb spun around, his gun raised, but what he saw made his stomach twist into knots. The man who had been sitting at the desk, the one they had interrogated, was now standing, a smug grin plastered on his face. He wasn't alone. Behind him stood a figure Caleb never expected to see. His old mentor, Sergeant Raymond Foster, the man who had trained him and shaped his early career. The man who had disappeared without a trace years ago. Raymond? Caleb's voice caught in his throat, disbelief clouding his judgment. What the hell is going on here? Foster's expression remained cold, detached, but there was a flicker of something in his eyes. Regret, maybe, or something more dangerous. "You should have stayed out of it, Caleb," he said, his voice low and ominous. "You were never meant to find out." Mara's eyes narrowed as she sized up the situation. She didn't speak. Instead, she took a step forward, her gun still trained on the mercenaries. The tension in the room was suffocating, the silence unbearable as Caleb tried to process the reunion he never wanted. "What is this place?" Caleb demanded, his voice hoarse. "And why the hell is my name on that screen?" Foster chuckled darkly, shaking his head. "You really think you can walk away from this, Caleb? This is bigger than you, bigger than both of us. You were always meant to be a part of it." Caleb's stomach twisted. "A part of what? What are you talking about?" The man at the desk stepped forward, his face pale and drawn. He seemed nervous now, a far cry from the arrogant man they had interrogated just moments ago. "You don't understand," he said, his voice shaky. "You were chosen, Caleb. It's all part of the plan. Everything you've been a part of, everything you've done. It was never just coincidence." "Chosen for what?" Caleb pressed, his mind racing. "What is this about?" Foster stepped forward, his face hardening as he glanced at the mercenaries. "It's about control, Caleb. Power. The people who run this show, they don't care about you or me. They care about one thing, keeping their grip on everything. And you, my old friend, are a tool they've been using for years." Caleb's mind reeled. A tool? He had fought in wars, served his country, and had done everything by the book. He was no one's pawn. Or so he thought. Mara's voice cut through the tension like a knife. "This isn't the time for explanations," she said, her eyes darting toward the mercenaries closing in on them. "We need to move." But Caleb didn't move. His gaze remained fixed on Foster, his mind struggling to comprehend the magnitude of the betrayal. The man he had looked up to, trusted, was now standing in front of him as the very embodiment of everything he had fought against. Foster didn't seem to care about the confrontation. His eyes were cold, his expression unwavering. "You should have stayed out of it, Caleb," he repeated, as if it were some mantra. "Now, you'll die for it." Before Caleb could react, one of the mercenaries lunged at him, but Mara was quicker. She sidestepped the man's attack, her elbow connecting with his throat in a swift, brutal motion. The mercenary dropped to the floor, gasping for air. "Keep moving," Mara urged, her voice laced with urgency. Caleb snapped out of his trance, his gun raised again. "Let's go," he said to Mara, his voice low but determined. They couldn't stay here, not with Foster in their midst. The room was a death trap, and every second they spent inside it brought them closer to being trapped. But as they turned to make their escape, Foster's voice rang out one last time. "You'll never escape," he called, his tone final. "We'll find you, Caleb. And when we do, you'll regret ever crossing us." Caleb didn't look back. They bolted for the door, charging down the hallway with no plan but survival. The sound of gunfire echoed in the distance, and Caleb's mind raced. They had to make it out, but more than that, he needed answers. And no matter what it took, he would get them. As they reached the exit, the blast of a distant explosion rattled the compound, shaking the ground beneath them. Caleb barely registered the sound as they burst out into the night, the cool air hitting their faces like a slap. The fight wasn't over. It had only just begun. The air was thick with the acrid scent of smoke and the distant echoes of explosions. Caleb and Mara sprinted through the darkened compound, their footsteps pounding against the cold concrete. The sound of gunfire continued to fill the night, but they couldn't afford to stop. Not now. They had to get out. "Keep moving." Mara's voice rang out over the chaos, her face set in a determined grimace. Caleb's heart pounded in his chest, his every instinct telling him to fight, to stand and face whatever was coming. But Mara was right. They needed to survive. They needed answers. Ahead, a narrow alleyway beckoned, a potential escape route. The flickering lights of the compound's exterior barely illuminated their path, but it was the only way forward. Caleb barely registered the sound of footsteps behind them, the growing realization that they were being hunted. Foster had made it clear that they would stop at nothing to find them. They were no longer just running for their lives. They were running out of time. "Mara," Caleb said, his voice low, "we need to find a way to contact the outside. If this is really as big as Foster says, we can't do it alone." Mara didn't answer immediately. She was focused, eyes darting around as she calculated their next move. "We'll find a way," she said finally, her voice steely. "But first, we need to get out of this hellhole." They rounded a corner, and the sight of a waiting black SUV stopped Caleb in his tracks. The vehicle's engine hummed, its headlights cutting through the darkness, and the doors swung open. A familiar figure was standing by the vehicle, watching them with a steady gaze. Caleb's breath caught in his throat. The man standing before them was none other than the person he least expected, Raymond Foster. "You're not going anywhere." Foster's voice was ice-cold, each word dripping with a mixture of threat and finality. "Foster." Caleb spat, his hands clenched into fists. "I don't know what game you're playing, but I'm done with it." Mara stepped forward, her eyes never leaving Foster. "You're the one who's done, Raymond. This ends tonight." Foster didn't flinch. He raised his hand, and with a flick of his wrist, the mercenaries who had been trailing them appeared from the shadows, weapons drawn and aimed directly at Caleb and Mara. The situation had become impossible. "You're outmatched," Foster said, his voice calm but tinged with mockery. "You should have listened to me when you had the chance, but you didn't. Now, we finish this." Caleb's mind raced. The danger was overwhelming, and the truth about Foster, the mercenaries, and the conspiracy was still just beyond his grasp. But he wasn't going to die here, not like this, not without answers. "Mara," Caleb whispered, barely audible over the chaos. "Do you trust me?" Mara glanced at him, her eyes sharp. She didn't say anything at first, but Caleb saw the flicker of understanding in her gaze. They had been through too much together. There was no time for hesitation now. "Let's end this," Mara said, and in that moment, Caleb knew they had a plan. In one swift motion, they both dove to the ground, narrowly dodging a barrage of gunfire. The mercenaries' shots missed, but they were closing in quickly. Mara rolled to the side, grabbing a flashbang from her belt, and threw it toward the mercenaries. The explosion of light and sound was blinding, and for a moment, the world spun into a chaotic blur. "Now!" Caleb shouted. Mara was already up, her gun raised. The mercenaries were disoriented, their vision clouded by the flashbang. Caleb and Mara took their chance, firing at the nearest targets. Shots rang out, and the remaining mercenaries staggered, falling one by one. Foster stood there, unmoving, his eyes locked on Caleb. His face betrayed no emotion, but his silence spoke volumes. He wasn't done. Not yet. "You really think you can just walk away?" Foster asked, his voice dripping with contempt. Caleb didn't hesitate. He raised his gun and aimed it directly at Foster's chest. For a brief moment, time seemed to freeze. They were face to face, two men who had once shared a bond now standing on opposite sides of a deadly divide. "It's over, Raymond," Caleb said, his voice steady. Foster's eyes narrowed. "You don't understand. You're not the one in control here. You never were." Before Caleb could react, a sharp, guttural noise filled the air. The unmistakable sound of a helicopter's rotor blades. Caleb's head whipped toward the sky. Another explosion rocked the compound, but this time it was closer. The ground beneath them trembled, and Caleb knew that whatever was coming next would change everything. "Go!" Caleb yelled to Mara, his voice urgent. "We can't stay here." Mara didn't hesitate. She bolted for the SUV, gun in hand. Caleb was right behind her, but as they reached the vehicle, a familiar face emerged from the shadows. It was the man who had helped them earlier, the one who had been part of the group behind the scenes, offering them assistance when they needed it most. "Get in!" the man shouted, his voice filled with desperation. "They're coming." Caleb and Mara didn't need to be told twice. They jumped into the SUV, slamming the doors shut as the engine roared to life. The vehicle shot forward, tearing through the compound's gates at breakneck speed. Behind them, the helicopter closed in, its spotlight flickering as it hovered overhead. "What the hell is going on?" Caleb demanded, his voice frantic. The man who had helped them turned to face him. "There's no time for explanations," he said, his face grim. "But the people behind all of this? They're far more dangerous than you realize. And they're not going to let you go that easily." As the SUV sped down the winding road, Caleb's mind raced. Foster had been right about one thing. This was bigger than he could have imagined. They had uncovered the tip of the iceberg, and now they were being hunted by forces far beyond their control. But one thing was certain, Caleb wasn't going down without a fight.